The archivist's cabin hummed with the weight of forgotten histories, its lone reading lamp flickering like a dying star as Ruinous Powers turned its scarred face beneath the research vessel's orbit. Arden Wren adjusted the polished brass lamp with ink-stained fingers, its warm glow pooling across vellum reports and data slates, while amber stormlight pulsed through the reinforced viewport like a diseased heartbeat. The air hung thick with the scent of his rituals beswax candles, weeping slow tears onto the desk, recaf steam curling from his chipped administratum mug, the sharp tang of stabilizing chemicals on ancient parchment. These comforts formed a fragile barrier against the void's indifference, against the blackened glass plains, below where lightning etched the graves of dead cities into the planet's skin. His chair creaked a familiar protest as he leaned back, silver-rimmed spectacles catching lamplight when he rubbed his eyes. 40 standard years of service to the Veritas Lux marked themselves in the stoop of his shoulders, in the tremor that sometimes crept into his hands when handling particularly fragile relics. Each dead world they'd chronicled lost to Xeno's predation, civilizational collapse, or far worse, fate had etched its silence into his bones. He existed in the liminal space between preservation and oblivion, capturing final whispers before they dissolved into the eternal dark. Today's discovery had sent ripples through the fleet's command spire, transforming his quiet sanctuary into the focal point of dangerous attention. The service cull hovering near the ceiling rotated with a soft whir, its red optic recording every minuscule movement per protocol. Those hollow eye sockets had witnessed countless artifacts pass through his hands, but never anything like the object now resting on the cushioned lectern book, bound in material that resembled leather yet radiated unnatural warmth, its surface seeming to thrum beneath his gloved fingertips. The Mechanicus stasis pod that had preserved it for millennia lay open nearby, frost still creeping across its fractured seals. Despite the sanctioned psyker's clearance, her haunted expression lingered in his memory like a stain. "Record everything," she'd breathed, the words slipping through bloodless lips, but believe nothing. The vessel's familiar rhythms, distant plasma drive vibrations, ventilation ducts sighing like sleeping giants did nothing to dispel the chill seeping from the book. Arden tightened his frayed woolen shawl, fingertips brushing the moth-eaten fabric his late sister had woven for his first expedition decades past. The scent of Terran frankincense coiled from a fresh candle, its gilded light revealing intricate filigree along the book's edges that shifted when viewed askance. His silver letter opener bearing the crest of Alias Secundus, where scholars still debated heresies in vaulted libraries hesitated over the binding. With a sound like a dying sigh, the cover yielded. Coppery sweetness flooded his nostrils, undercut by something darker, organic, reminiscent of battlefields after rain. The turning page whispered not with parchment's dry protest, but with the moist slide of something alive. No imperial aquila graced the first leaf. Instead, flames writhed around an open tome from which a serpent emerged, jaws spread as if to swallow stars whole. Below this blasphemy, words shimmered wetly, the bearer of dark truths, a chronicle of the XVII Legion. Arden's breath caught as glacial fingers traced his spine. Word bearers, architects of the heresy that nearly shattered the Imperium. Protocols screamed for him to seal the text, summon the commissar, watch as purity flames cleansed this poison. Yet his trembling hand reached again for the page, for here lay not some second-hand account penned by imperial historians, but the raw, unfiltered voice of traitors preserved through 10 millennia. Through the viewport, Ruinous Powers' atmosphere convulsed, lightning strobing across continents in fractal patterns that prickled his augmetic eye. The ship's solemn bells announced night's cycle, their echoes deadened by the tome's oppressive presence. His recaf had gone cold, bitterness mirroring the conflict tightening his chest, historian against servant, curiosity against doctrine. The quill stood ready in its inkwell, service cull waiting to transcribe his observations into sterilized reports. One paragraph, he bargained silently, one glimpse into the abyss for the sake of understanding its depth. The chronicle began not with battles or geneforging, but with a meditation on truth that made his pulse stutter. Words slithered into his mind, elegant script twisting familiar imperial axioms into grotesque parodies. His cabin dissolved the hum of machinery, the faint chants of techadeps performing the evening rite, even the ache in his lower back fading, as the text pulled him down into its lyric madness. Lightning flashed again, casting the heretical symbol in stark relief against the wall, its serpent seeming to writhe in the sudden glare. Arden read on, oblivious. The chronicle spoke of nights when Terra's soil still steamed with the blood of unification, when the Emperor walked embodied among men, and his grand design unfolded like a poisonous bloom. From Genelab's wrought in desperation's fires arose the Legion's Astartes 20 pillars, meant to support a new galactic order. And among them the XVII emerged cloaked in solemn purpose. Imperial heralds they were first named, not mere conquerors but apostles bearing the imperial truth, their armored feet crushing superstition's last strongholds across the ravaged galaxy. cold zeal burned from the pages, the chronicler's adoration for these warriors who approached war not as art nor sport, but as calculated deconstruction. Where brother legions reveled in combat's fury, the heralds moved with ritualistic precision, their black armor absorbing starlight as they dismantled civilizations. A herald would stride forth alone onto each new world, death's head visage reflecting in the terrified eyes of priest-kings and demagogues. The ultimatum echoed through throne rooms and hovels alike: renounce false gods or perish in secular fire. The chronicle painted vivid tableau the hallowed children of unification wars vanquished, raised to become the emperor's most implacable zealots. On Primarch V, they executed the self-proclaimed living deities with clinical efficiency, printers roaring as freshly converted citizens received their first ration of imperial propaganda. In Asgal's cavern cities, they dismantled the techno-oracles not through bombardment, but by exposing the crude machinery behind miracles, letting disillusionment rot faith from within. Theirs was a crusade of unmaking, each battle stripping away layers of belief until only stark rationality remained. They fought without joy, without Rajiach bolter round a syllogism, every chainsword strike a QED, proving the futility of resistance against inevitable enlightenment. The text detailed their isolation, how other legions mistook their solemnity for arrogance. No victory feasts adorned their ships, no honors decorated their armor. Only duty remained, absolute and all-consuming. Yet beneath the chronicler's reverence, Arden sensed insidious wormshots of discontent curling through grand pronouncements, mentions of spiritual voids and yearnings unrecognized. He leaned closer, quill forgotten, as his racing heart outpaced the service call's documentation. The lamplight dimmed, though the power gauges showed steady. Frost crept across his mug. Outside, Ruinous Powers stormed synchronized with the text's rhythm, lightning etching hexagrammic patterns across the observation window. The chronicle's tone shifted subtle at first, like poison seeping through parchment. A chapter titled Lorgar's Revelation began with the discovery of their genocide, but Arden's breath hitched at the description of cultists, its desert sands shifting to swallow ancient temples even as they were exhumed. The word bearer's transformation unfurled in disturbing vignettes warriors, who once raised cathedrals now kneeling in prayer, chaplains who quoted new scriptures where only cold reason had reigned, the slow perversion of their heraldic maces into censers streaming narcotic smoke. Arden's throat tightened when he recognized the serpentine flame emblem from the chronicle's cover adorning reborn battle standards. The text swelled with zealous fervor now, exulting in the crusade of enlightenment, where entire populations were not freed from ignorance, but drowned in fresh dogmas. Where earlier passages dissected tactics with scholarly detachment, these pages throbbed with religious ecstasy, describing entire companies lost to chanting trances, battles postponed for days of ritual slaughter. His gloved finger traced a passage describing the burning of Monarchia, the chronicler's glee sickeningly vivid, as they recounted humbling the ultramarines retribution delivered not for strategic gain, but for perceived spiritual slights. The air grew cloying, that coppery scent intensifying until he tasted blood at the back of his tongue. The service cull emitted a static whine, dipping lower as if drawn to the pages. Arden barely noticed. His heart hammered against learned caution, the thrill of raw historiography warring with growing dread. These weren't mere accounts of battles, it was a conversion manual, every rhetorical flourish designed to lure readers into sympathy, then admiration, then emulation. Outside, the ship's lumens flickered in sympathy with the planet's escalating storms, casting the cabin into strobing chiaroscuro. Still, he read. The Horus Heresy section opened not with betrayal, but with beatific descriptions of warp storms as the god's first breath upon real space. Arden's spectacles fogged with his rapid breaths as the chronicle justified treachery, with perverse logichau service to rotting imperial truths had been the real heresy, how enlightenment came only through embracing the primordial forces humanity had foolishly denied. He flinched at loving descriptions of demonic symbiosis, at soldiers willingly hollowing themselves to become vessels for never-born entities. The tome's pages felt slick now, leaving faint red smudges on his gloves where he turned them. Something rustled in the cabin's cornersnot rat or service cull, but wetter sounds, accompanied by the phantom pressure of breath on his neck. The chronicle's final chapters detailed the siege of Terra itself from the traitor's perspective, the parchment seeming to blister as he reached passages describing the imperial palace's desecration. Words squirmed beneath his gaze, letters rearranging themselves into catechisms that bypassed conscious thought to coil directly into his hindbrain. His recaf cup shattered on the deck, ignored. Sweat froze on his brow despite the book's feverish heat radiating against his chest. Only when a drop of black fluid fell onto the page with a sizzle did he look up, not to the ceiling, but to the service cull hovering inches from his face, its optic weeping viscous darkness as crimson warning runes cascaded across its casing. The skull's jaw clacked soundlessly, trailing tendrils of shadow that dissolved before touching the desk. Distantly, the clarion call of general quarters echoed through the ship. Alarms blared Xeno's incursion, warp rift detected, atmospheric containment failed there, urgency muffled as if heard through water. Arden tried to rise, to seal the cursed tome, but his limbs refused obedience. The viewport swam in his vision. Ethanus 5 storms now a maelstrom of impossible colors, lightning forming the same serpentine flame symbol branded into the book's cover. His eyes dragged back to the pages against his will, the chronicle's final lines swelling in his vision, their calligraphic curves morphing into barbed hooks that sank deep into his psyche. The last thing he consciously understood was the sensation of warm blood trickling from his nostrils as his own hand, moving with alien purpose, dipped his quill into the inkwell and began transcribing the glowing verses onto fresh parchment. The service skull's crimson optic flared brighter, documenting everything. Behind them, civilizations fundamentally transformed. Where once stood temples and cathedrals, monuments to superstition and fear, now rose the stark edifices of imperial compliance, functional, rational, and utterly without spiritual meaning. This was the 17th Legion before they found their Primarch, before they became the word-bearers. They were the iconoclasts, the breakers of false faiths, the heralds of a new secular age. In the grand plan of the Emperor, they were to be the vanguard of reason, clearing away the rubble of humanity's spiritual past to make way for a future built on the bedrock of science and logic. The bitter irony of their later fall, their transformation into the most zealous servants of the very powers they once opposed, cannot be understood without first recognizing what they originally were before they became bearers of dark truths. They were bearers of what they believed was the ultimate truth. That humanity's destiny lay not in the worship of higher powers, but in the conquest of its own future. Caucasus was a world of faith and whispered prayers. Religion wasn't merely practiced there. It was breathed in with the desert air, tasted in the dust that coated every pilgrim's lips, and felt in the beating of every heart beneath its amber sun. To the people of this feudal world, the worship of higher powers was as natural and necessary as the crying of children or the passage of seasons. Once long ago, Caucasus had known the touch of advanced technology, but those days had faded into myth during the long isolation of Old Night. What remained was a society bound by tradition, where life's rhythms were dictated by ancient beliefs, and the certainty that while disease might co-generations and wars might stain the land with blood, the gods remained eternal. It was onto this world of deep spiritual devotion that the infant Primarch's gestation pod fell from the skies. The golden child, who would one day be known as Lorgar, came to rest in the harsh desert wastes, far from the centers of civilization. For 17 days, the child lay in his shattered capsule, found and tended by a nomadic tribe called the Declined, led by their chieftain, Fan Morgul. These desert outcasts, shunned by the great cities, named the extraordinary child Lorgar, the Rainaller, for they believed his coming heralded change. Change indeed came swiftly, though not as the Declined had hoped. Before the strange golden child could settle into his new life, another group of travelers discovered him. A caravan of religious exiles led by a man whose name would become inseparable from Lorgar's destiny. Corian, once a priest of the dominant religion on Caucasus, a faith known as the Covenant. Corian had been exiled from the Covenant seat of power in the city of Varadish, cast out for advocating more aggressive conversion tactics. In the desert, he led a band of like-minded zealots, continuing to practice the Covenant's faith away from the eyes of its ruling hierarchs. When he laid eyes upon the child Lorgar, who had already grown to the size of a young boy in mere weeks, Coran saw an opportunity, a weapon to be wielded against those who had cast him out. With calculated brutality, Cor Farron ordered the slaughter of Fan Morg and the Declined, ensuring there would be no competing claim to the Golden Child's origins or loyalty. Thus began Lorgar's new life under the harsh tutelage of the exiled priest, a relationship built on a foundation of manipulation, abuse, and religious indoctrination. Life with Corian was not gentle. The priest subjected young Lorgar to vicious emotional and physical abuses, seeking to shape the Primarch's extraordinary mind and break his will. Yet even as Corian's harsh hand fell again and again, Lorgar found solace in the teachings of the Covenant itself. The young Primarch devoured every theological text he could find, his mind comprehending and synthesizing religious concepts at a rate that astonished even the learned priests in Corian's band of exiles. The Covenant, unknown to its followers, was a faith with dark roots. Its pantheon of gods, entities of power, knowledge, pleasure, and change, were in truth the four great powers of the war. Chaos gods wearing benevolent masks. For centuries, the people of Kois had unknowingly worshipped these entities, their prayers feeding the very powers that would one day consume so much of the galaxy in darkness. As Lorgar grew in knowledge and wisdom, he began to develop his own interpretation of the Covenant's teachings. Where the traditional faith saw a collection of separate divine entities, Lorgar perceived a deeper truth that these various gods were aspects of a single greater divinity he called the One. This theological insight wasn't merely academic. It represented the first stirrings of Lorgar's unique gift, his ability to perceive patterns and connections where others saw only disparate elements. Corferin initially rejected these ideas as dangerous heresy, using them as pretext for further abuse. Yet even as he struck the young Primarch for his theological innovations, the exiled priest recognized the power in Lorgar's words and the extraordinary charisma with which he delivered them. Gradually, Cor's strategy shifted from breaking Lorgar to harnessing the Primarch's gifts for his own ambitions. Despite, or perhaps because of the suffering he endured, Lorgar remained strangely loyal to his foster father. When the crew of their caravan mutinied against Corferin's cruelty, it was Lorgar who intervened to save the priest's life, demonstrating both his compassion and his growing physical power. This act marked a turning point in their relationship. Though the abuse didn't end entirely, Corian began to show occasional moments of genuine affection toward his adopted son, naming him the Bearer of the Word, a title that would one day define not just Lorgar, but an entire legion of Space Marines. Lorgar's natural charisma and oratorical gifts soon began to draw followers. His sermons delivered with eloquence and insight spoke to something deep in the hearts of those who heard him. He spoke of unity, of purpose, of a divine plan that encompassed all humanity. Most compelling was his vision of the One, a singular God who bound together all divine forces, a being of light and truth who would one day come to Caucus to lead its people to the stars. As his reputation grew, Lorgar began to act on his deepening convictions. He led raids to free slaves across Cause, building an army of devoted followers who called themselves the Godsworn. These warriors fought for the new religious vision Lorgar proclaimed, a vision that challenged the orthodoxy of the Covenant while using its own symbols and language. The confrontation between Lorgar's growing movement and the established religious hierarchy was inevitable. As the Godsworn's numbers swelled, the leaders of the Covenant in Varadish began to see Lorgar not as a curious heretic in the desert, but as an existential threat to their power. When Lorgar finally marched on Varadish, the capital city of the Covenant, the stage was set for either massacre or miracle. It was the latter that occurred. After a fiery sermon delivered before the city gates in which Lorgar outlined his vision of religious unity and purpose, the gates of Varadish opened without battle. Inside, Lorgar found the lower priests of the Covenant waiting with offerings, the corpses of the ruling ecclesiarch and his hierarchs presented as gifts to their city's new spiritual. Whether through fear, genuine religious conversion, or simple political calculation, Varadish had chosen to accept rather than resist the Golden Prophet. This bloodless victory was not to be repeated across all cultures. From Varadish, Lorgar's forces moved from city to city, offering the same choice: accept the new interpretation of faith or face destruction. Many surrendered peacefully, converting to Lorgar's vision of the One. Others resisted and were put to the sword, their populations massacred as heretics against the new orthodoxy. The irony that Lorgar was employing the very tactics that would one day be used against his own legion by the Emperor went unremarked in the bloody years that followed. This conflict, which would later be known as the Skies Wars, raged across Kiss for years, forcing the entire population to choose between the old faith and Lorgar's new vision. The last city to stand against the Godsworn was Gahala, protected by an ancient technological relic, a storm generator dating back to the lost golden age of humanity, capable of creating a raging maelstrom around the city's perimeter. In what appeared to be divine intervention, Lorgar approached the howling storm and with a gesture parted the tempest. His army poured through the gap, capturing Gahala in what many saw as final proof of Lorgar's divine mandate. Whether this feat was an early manifestation of Lorgar's latent psychic abilities, or simply a technological solution discovered by his brilliant mind, remains a matter of debate among imperial scholars. With the fall of Gahala, Lorgar stood as the undisputed master of all cultures. His first act was to name Corian as the High Priest of the Reformed Covenant, a position of power for the man who had both raised and tormented him. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Lorgar announced to his followers that their work had only begun. The one he proclaimed would soon arrive on Caucus within a year of their final victory. This divine being would be known to them simply as the Emperor. Throughout these years of conquest, Lorgar had been haunted by visions, dreams of a mighty warrior in gleaming bronze armor coming to Kois, accompanied by a one-eyed giant in blue robes. These visions grew increasingly intense, driving Lorgar to proclaim the imminent arrival of Kois God. This prophecy caused further disruption to the newly established religious order, as some among the Old Covenant saw an opportunity to strike against Lorgar's growing power. When agents of the Old Faith came to arrest Lorgar for heresy, his followers killed them without hesitation. This violence triggered the second phase of the Schism Wars, an even bloodier conflict that culminated in Lorgar's forces storming the Cathedral of Illumination, the heart of the Old Covenant's power, where Lorgar himself had once studied. The defenders were slaughtered to the last, eliminating the final organized resistance to Lorgar's religious vision. After this final victory, it is said that one-third of the people of Cultists had turned against Lorgar, resulting in the first great purge conducted by the Godsworn's warrior monks. These fanatics, hand-selected by Lorgar himself, scoured the planet for any who still clung to the old interpretations of faith, ensuring that only one vision of the One would prevail. Throughout these blood-soaked years, Khorran remained at Lorgar's side, outwardly embracing his adoptive son's theology while privately maintaining his belief in the old gods of the Covenant. He explained to Lorgar while he believed in the One, he also believed that the 4 traditional deities of the Covenant were real, with the One simply being the most powerful among them. This subtle corruption, this insistence on the reality of what were unknown to both men, the Chaos Gods, would lay the foundation for the Wordbearer's eventual turn to darkness. As peace finally settled over the scarred world of Cultists, Lorgar stood as both its spiritual and temporal ruler, a golden demigod who had unified a planet through a combination of charisma, vision, and ruthless violence. His followers looked to him with adoration, certain that the prophecy of the Emperor's coming would soon be fulfilled. Lorgar himself gazed at the stars with growing anticipation, sensing that his true destiny lay not on the desert world of his childhood, but in the vast cosmos beyond. He would not have long to wait. Less than a year after the final victory of the Godsworn, just as Lorgar had prophesied, a fleet of massive vessels appeared in the skies above Kos. The Emperor had come to claim his lost son, and the next chapter of Lorgar's story, one that would ultimately shake the foundations of the Imperium itself, was about to begin. The sky above Culus blazed with golden light as the Emperor's fleet arrived, exactly as Lorgar had prophesied. Less than a year had passed since the final victory of the Godsworn, and now the heavens themselves seemed to part, revealing vessels of such magnificent scale that they appeared as new moons in the amber sky. As the massive ships descended through the atmosphere, the people of Cultists gathered in awe and trepidation. Many wept openly, overcome by the majesty of what they witnessed. Among them stood Lorgar, his golden skin aglow with reflected light, his heart pounding with emotion. Here at last was the answer to every question he had ever asked, the meaning behind every vision that had haunted his dreams. The Emperor came accompanied by the crimson-skinned Primarch Magnus the Red, just as Lorgar had foreseen. With them marched the Thousand Sons Astartes in their burnished armor. As the Emperor descended from his landing craft, resplendent in golden armor that caught the desert sun, there could be no doubt in Lorgar's mind or heart. This was the divine being he had awaited, the one who would lead humanity to its destined greatness. In that moment of first meeting, as father and son stood face to face beneath the Kachisian sun, Lorgar did what came most naturally to him. He knelt in worship. Without hesitation, without doubt, he prostrated himself before the Emperor, his forehead touching the desert soil in perfect obeisance. Behind him, like a wave breaking upon the shore, the entire population of the city followed suit, tens of thousands kneeling as one before their living god. The celebrations that followed were elaborate, a world-spanning expression of religious devotion that lasted for months. Every city on Cultists held ceremonies honoring the Emperor's arrival, with prayers and hymns rising day and night from countless throats. Offerings piled high before makeshift altars bearing the Emperor's likeness, and children born during this time were given names that honored his coming. Throughout these festivities, it is said that the Emperor showed signs of discomfort, even disapproval. He had not journeyed across the stars to be worshipped, but to reunite humanity under the banner of secular reason, the imperial truth that expressly rejected the notion of divinity. Yet for Lorgar, the distinction between the Emperor's wishes and what he perceived as the Emperor's nature created no conflict. That the master of mankind denied his own godhood only proved his divinity all the more, for who but a true god would refuse the worship he so clearly deserved? As the celebrations drew to a close, the Emperor offered Lorgar command of the 17th Legion, the Imperial Heralds, crafted from his own gene seed. Lorgar accepted this gift with heartfelt gratitude, seeing in it not as a military role, but a sacred calling, a chance to spread word of the Emperor's greatness to every corner of the galaxy. The Legion would no longer be the Imperial Heralds, but would henceforth be known as the Wordbearers, carrying the truth of the Emperor's divinity to all mankind. Khorran, despite his advanced age, underwent the partial process of Space Marine transformation. Though he could never become a true Space Marine, the augmentations were sufficient to make him a warrior capable of fighting alongside the Legion. Lorgar named him first captain and chief advisor, ensuring that the man who had raised him would remain at his side in the great journey to come. The reunion of Primarch and Legion was a profound transformation that would alter the 17th Legion to its very core. The gray armored iconoclasts, those ruthless destroyers of faith, found themselves under the leadership of a Primarch whose every thought and action was infused with religious devotion. The contradiction could not have been more stark, nor its resolution more complete. Lorgar approached his legion as a father, embracing long-lost children. He walked among them, learning their names and histories, sharing with them not battle plans, but visions. Visions of a galaxy united in worship of the divine emperor. His warmth and genuine care for his Gene sons created bonds of loyalty far stronger than mere military discipline could achieve. The transformation began slowly but accelerated as Lorgar's influence spread through the ranks. The Legion's structure remained outwardly unchanged, with companies and chapters organized much as before. But beneath this familiar framework, a new soul was taking shape. Old rituals of war gave way to ceremonies of devotion. The Spartan chambers of Legion vessels filled with candles and incense. Battle became a sacred rite, each victory an offering laid at the Emperor's feet. Most significant was Lorgar's elevation of the black-clad heralds, who had once delivered the Emperor's ultimatums to worlds resistant to imperial truth. These warriors, who had symbolized the Legion's role as destroyers of false faith, were given new authority and purpose. No longer just messengers of compliance, they became guardians of spiritual welfare both for conquered populations and for their brother Estarts. Lorgar called them chaplain and charged them with maintaining the moral and spiritual strength of the Legion. These chaplain became the beating heart of the transformed 17th Legion. Clad in black armor, adorned with skulls and religious iconography, they moved among their brothers, delivering sermons, leading prayers, and ensuring that every action served the greater glory of the Emperor. Their role was unprecedented among the Space Marines, though it would later be adopted in modified, secularized form by other legions following the Council of Nicaea. Under the chaplain's guidance, new words and concepts entered the Legion's vocabulary. Terms like apostle, ageme, and creed that tasted of the dust and incense of cultures. The warriors who had once condemned any deviation from rational thought now used the language of faith to describe their purpose and mission. Most tellingly, they began to use the word heresy to describe dangerous or deviant ideas within their own ranks, a concept drawn from the very religious traditions they had once sought to eradicate. As the word-bearers joined the Great Crusade, their approach to imperial compliance stood in stark contrast to their previous methods. Where once they had destroyed the symbols of faith with cold efficiency, now they raised monuments and cathedrals, venerating the Emperor on every world they conquered. Where once they had burned religious texts as dangerous superstition, now they distributed copies of Lorgar's own writings, particularly the controversial Lectitio Divinitatis, a text that explicitly argued for the Emperor's divinity. The change extended to the Legion's appearance as well. Their storm gray armor was repainted in deep crimson, adorned with prayers and passages from holy texts inscribed in gold lettering. Their vessels, once utilitarian war machines, became floating cathedrals filled with shrines and reliquaries. Even their weapons were consecrated in elaborate ceremonies, blessed to better serve in what the word-bearers increasingly viewed as a holy war to unite humanity under the Emperor's divine rule. This transformation was not immediate, nor was it achieved without resistance. Many of the original Terran-born estates of the 17th Legion struggled with their Primarch's religious fervor, finding it at odds with the secular principles they had fought to uphold. Lorgar understood these concerns and addressed them not with punishment but with patience, spending countless hours in conversation with troubled battle brothers, sharing his vision and his certainty. Gradually, even the most skeptical were won over by Lorgar's genuine warmth and charisma. The Primarch's gift was not just oratory, but empathy, an ability to connect with others so profound that it bordered on the supernatural. When Lorgar spoke of his faith, it was not with the cold certainty of a zealot, but with the loving conviction of a father guiding his children toward a beautiful truth. Even those who had once proudly called themselves iconoclasts found themselves drawn to his vision, their hearts opening to possibilities they had previously condemned. For those few who could not reconcile themselves to the Legion's new direction, there were quieter solutions. Some were assigned to distant expeditionary fleets, others to garrison duties far from Lorgar's influence. In time, these holdouts either embraced the new way or met their ends in battle, their places taken by fresh recruits from Caucaes, who had never known any creed but devotion to the Emperor as divine. The influx of Sichesian recruits further transformed the Legion, infusing it with the religious traditions and cultural practices of Lorgar's adopted home world. These new estates brought with them not only unwavering faith, but also the battle traditions of the godsworn, ritualistic approaches to warfare that emphasized symbolism and spiritual meaning alongside tactical considerations. The Legion that emerged from this blending of cultures was neither purely Terran nor purely Caucasian, but something unique, a brotherhood bound by shared devotion rather than mere military purpose. Central to this new identity was the personal relationship between Lorgar and his Gene sons. Unlike some Primarchs who maintained distance from their legions or related to them primarily as military assets, Lorgar treated his warriors as family. He shared meals with common battle brothers, remembered their names and personal histories, and mourned deeply for each loss. This genuine connection fostered a loyalty that transcended military discipline, creating a legion that would follow their Primarch, not out of duty, but out of love. As the Wordbearers continued their part in the Great Crusade, they became known for the thoroughness of their conquests. A world brought to compliance by the 17th Legion was not just defeated militarily, but transformed culturally. Its population instructed in the worship of the Emperor and integrated fully into the spiritual life of the Imperium as the Wordbearers envisioned it. Monuments of unprecedented scale rose on these worlds, vast cathedrals and statues that dominated city skylines, physical embodiment of the Legion's devotion. Yet even as the Crusade expanded, the contradiction at the heart of their purpose remained unresolved. The Emperor had created the Primarchs and their legions to spread the imperial truth, a secular doctrine that explicitly rejected religious worship. The Wordbearers under Lorgar's guidance had become the very thing they were intended to eliminate, bearers not of secular reason, but of religious faith. This fundamental contradiction would eventually lead to consequences more devastating than anyone could have foreseen. But in those early years, as the Wordbearers spread across the stars, bearing word of the Emperor's divinity, such concerns seemed distant and abstract. The Legion had found its true purpose, its soul aligned with its Primarch's vision. That this vision stood in opposition to the Emperor's own wishes was a truth too painful to acknowledge. A seed of discord that would in time blossom into galaxy-spanning betrayal. During these years of crusade, Lorgar composed his greatest work, the Lectio Divinitatis, a treatise that systematically argued for the Emperor's divine nature, drawing on philosophical traditions from across human history and incorporating insights from his unique perspective as a Primarch. He created a document of extraordinary persuasive power. The text did not just assert the Emperor's godhood, but proved it through careful reasoning, presenting evidence that would convince even the most skeptical minds. Initially shared only among the higher echelons of the Wordbearers, copies of the Lectio Divinitatis began to circulate more widely as the Great Crusade progressed. Ship crews and imperial army regiments who fought alongside the 17th Legion carried the text to new theaters of war. Administrators and diplomats who had been stationed on worlds converted by the Wordbearers took the document with them to new assignments. Slowly, quietly, the seed of faith planted by Lorgar spread throughout the Imperium. The Lectio Divinitatis found particularly fertile ground among the common people of the Imperium. For ordinary humans confronted with the vastness of the galaxy and the horrors it contained, the idea of the Emperor as a divine protector offered comfort that cold secular rationalism could not provide. They did not the sharp edges of the imperial truth sliced against the soft devotion of Lorgar's teachings, unnoticed by those who craved solace in a galaxy, trembling beneath the tread of gods and monsters. Where rationalists saw contradiction, lost souls saw hope, a fragile flame held aloft in hopeless voids, passed from hand to shaking hand in the dark. The Lectio Divinitatis spread like mycelial threads through the body of the Great Crusade, its pages pressed between the ceramite fingers of iron hands who lingered too long over its passages, its arguments debated in the stratagem halls of ultramarines vessels when commands were silent. Marvel of marvels, these demigods of cold reason and calculated war found themselves inexplicably moved, their transhuman minds circling the same ancient longings that haunted mortal herds. Some burned the books with righteous scorn. Others hid them in armor compartments near their hearts, tracing golden filigree embossed upon the cover, as though the texture alone conveyed forbidden comfort. First-hand witnesses to the Emperor's immolating glory proved most susceptible those who had seen suns bow and dimensions unravel beneath their master's will, for how could such cosmic majesty be shackled within the sterile chains of secular philosophy? Amongst the expeditionary fleets drifting through poisoned stars, whispers bloomed into open secrets, agri-worlds baptized in the Emperor's name, forbidden shrines emerging like lichen on compliance-conquered stones, ecclesiarchy's cancerous infancy taking root decades before its official birth. Such reports coiled like smoke through Malcador's sanctum, each new datum etched onto cerviscal parchments with the sigillite's tightening jaw. Here lay the rot, the sweet-sick reversal of all they'd bled, to build the imperial truth hollowed from within by the very sun sworn to uphold it. Yet pragmatism stayed the Emperor's hand as his realm stretched its aching limbs across impossible distances. Checkmate by logistics. How does one chastise a Primarch half a galactic arm away, whose tithe streams flowed pure, whose compliant worlds burned brighter with zeal than any cold, rationalist outpost? Let the deviation linger, the thinking went. Passing fever soon sweated out as enlightenment's tide rose, warnings dispatched like paper arrows against ceramite. Lorgar received them as one might interpretive weather, confident the lack of thunder implied divine consent. Thus emboldened, the Urizen bent his architect's soul toward heresy sculpted in marble and sunlight monarchia, the god city, rising from Kur's verdant womb. Every stone wept perfection. Mountain arms cradled the valley, where sacred geometry unfolded beneath Lorgar's obsessed gaze, broad avenues spoking outward from the Nexus Plaza like calcified rays of holy light. The river became liquid scripture, mirroring gold-leaf bridges where pilgrims crossed themselves at each step. No mere metropolis, this was psalm-given form. Even the lowliest hablocks sang with proportions plucked from cosmic harmony, each cornice angled to catch dawn's first gilding as a sacrament. Statues lined the processional Magnificat not as artwork, but as stations of the cross warrior, scholar, healer, judge until the central titan loomed 60 meters tall, the Emperor's stone eyes gazing down with such impossible compassion that hardened legionaries removed their helms to weep. Fresh garlands coiled daily around granite feet, petals clinging to gauntlet grooves where worshippers pressed reverent touches like transmitting prayers through cold rock. But the cathedrals, oh, the cathedrals. Their argent spires skewered the stratosphere, vaulted naves swallowing multitudes beneath kaleidoscopic domes, where stained glass crusade scenes bled colored light onto uplifted faces. 10,000 voices swelled in hymnals, acoustics tuned so precisely that the lowest bass notes resonated in ribcage, a physical devotion felt rather than heard. Legion artificers and Martian adepts collaborated on reliquaries holding single strands of the Emperor's hair, on incense burners exhaling drugged opiates of sanctity. Lorgar wandered cloaked among artisans, correcting mortar lines between scripture recitations, his calloused Primarch's hands laying foundation stones alongside masons. Selection for citizenship required sacramental vetting, purity of faith measured in donated organs and middenverse penance. Children suckled on lectitio verses before milk. For decades the city swelled, a glimmering canker pulsing with alien fervor, until even circling voidcraft could discern its geometries from orbit praise stamped onto a planetary surface, undeniable as a brand. Terra's reaction came not as a tide, but an ice age sudden, absolute, glacially precise. The Ultramarines materialized above Monarchia without heralds, their azure prows eclipsing the sun that gilded sacred rooftops. Puzzlement turned to panic when evacuation orders crackled through voxcasters. Households pressed sacred texts to chests as Ultramarine kill squads moved block by immaculate block, no bolters fired, no chainswords revved, only implacable hands prying old women from doorframes when hymns failed. Resistance proved spiritual, not physical. Peasants prostrated beneath attacked transports, offering throats to landing gear rather than abandoned consecrated ground. By dusk, refugee camps stank of betrayed piety beyond the valley rim, psalms still rising as orbital lances kissed steeples. What followed wasn't destruction but surgical uncreation. Macro cannons erased cathedrals with laughable ease, one salvo collapsing arches that had taken generations to raise. Stone saints exploded mid-benediction, raining shards onto gardens where novices once meditated. Fire dances began as legionary flamer teams marched methodic patterns, annihilating archives whose illuminated scripts blackened mid-praise verse. Melting gold traced Rorschach patterns in the dirt while acoustic towers toppled inward, swallowing choir echoes into choking dust. Gulliman watched from orbit, his strategic genius turned to desecration, raising patterns into rubble so thorough no future archaeologist could misinterpret intent. And still the deepest blade waited. A summons in the Emperor's voice compelled every word-bearer to stand before the smoking pyre of their dream. Robot arranged his warriors' perimeter cobalt wall around Crimson Sea. No banners flew, no war horns sounded, then light. Bucephalus descended like a steel eclipse, ramp disgorging golden giants whose silence screamed louder than sirens. When the Emperor struck his sons down psionically, 100,000 legionaries, kneecapped by thought alone, Lorgar's vertebrae didn't crack from the impact, but from the weight of revelation. There in the ash, fingers splayed against powdered saints, the scales fell. Not disapproval, but total negation. His entire existence, the pilgrimage, the churches, monarchy's beating heart, all child's fingerpaint before an uncaring parent. The pressure didn't stop at marrow-deep agony. It crawled inside his genicode, rewriting devotion's DNA into something rancid and eternal. Above him, enthroned in contempt, his father spoke the only truth that mattered: now you built the wrong empire. And in the smoldering silence between Primarchs, the first spores of the heresy found fertile soil. The air hung thick with the acrid sting of plasma-scorched stone and the dry, choking taste of pulverized marble. A bitter perfume clinging to the ruination spread beneath Lorgar's knees. His armor, once polished to a devotional gleam, was caked in the gray dust of Monarchia's corpse, each particle a tiny blasphemy against the dream he'd shaped here, the paradise gutted by divine decree. Tears carved ravines through the grime on his face, hot and relentless, yet their salt felt meaningless against the cosmic desolation hollowing his chest. The Emperor's departure wasn't merely a retreat of golden light from the cursed sky. It was the uncreation of Lorgar's soul, a dissection of every certainty he'd ever nursed. Every sermon bellowed across conquered worlds, every colonnade raised in sacred geometry to honor a living god, every hymn whispered by billions of faithful throats, all of it now was ash. Worse than ash, a malignancy, a poison his own deity had purged with fire and sentence. The silence left in the warship's wake was deafening, a physical weight pressing his spine deeper into submission, even as his mind fractured under revelation. The god he adored had named that adoration a cancer. The love he'd poured into the universe had been returned as contempt. Around him, his legion knelt like graven idols, their ceramite still humming with the aftershock of psychic annihilation. The aura of zealous warmth that once radiated from the XVII legion had curdled, replaced by a glacial stillness. Where fervent chants once swelled, now only the whimper of settling rubble whispered. Some stared blankly at their gauntlets, fingers flexing as if unsure they still belonged to bodies now stripped of purpose. Others clenched fists so tight the servos whined, jaws locked behind helm seals, swallowing curses like shards of glass. Humiliation curdled into something sharper, colder, a collective inhalation held too long waiting to erupt. They had been architects of glory, weavers of imperial truth in stone and spirit, and now their legacy was a crater, their Primarch broken, their faith declared heresy against the very throne they'd sought to glorify. The Ultramarines' patient stare from the city's edge, the Custods' impassive vigilthes were footnotes to the true sentence echoing in each word-bearer's skull. You were never needed, you were never loved. Days blurred aboard the Fidelita's Lex, the ship's corridors echoing with an unfamiliar hush. Lorgar's absence from the command decks, from the chapels he'd once filled with sonorous meditations, left a void that seeped into the Legion's bones like radiation. Within his sealed chambers, the Primarch sat amidst the ruins of his soul's architecturesque-headed scrolls of the Lectio Divinitatis strewn like fallen leaves, ink weeping under tear salt into nebulous stains that mirrored the chaos in his mind. The manuscripts were carcasses now, their elegantly reasoned arguments reduced to lunatic ravings. A mosaic of Colchian jade, painstakingly assembled to depict the Emperor's ascension, lay cracked in a corner, its shards catching the low light like accusing eyes. He'd built civilizations in the warped shadow, raised temples that sang with transcendent harmony, and now creation itself felt obscene. His hands, which had drafted treatises and traced benedictions in air, lay limp at his sides. Every breath was labor. The weight that compressed his once-proud frame was metaphysical, the gravity of a cosmos collapsing inward. Yet two shadows moved in this personal eclipse. Cor Pharon, stooped with age, his face a relief map of bitterness masked as paternal concern, and Erebus, a blade masquerading as a priest, his voice honeyed with sympathetic certainty. They came bearing no battle plans, no strategic projectionsinly reminders. Cor Pharon's hand gnarled, deceptive in its fragility, settled on Lorgar's shuddering shoulder as they spoke of Cultists. Not of emperors, but of older nights when the winds carried whispers from the howling desert, when the Coven's rituals under twin moons had sung truths deeper than imperial edicts. The gods were patient once, Cor Pharon murmured, not mentioning names, not yet. They did not scorn devotion, they hungered for it. Remember the comfort of their presence in your boyhood dreams, the certainty they bestowed, before the sky broke open with gold. Erebus, ever the theologian, wielded questions like scalpels peeling back dogma. Why deny divinity when it walks among us? He gestured to a hololithic star map, the pinpricks of compliant worlds. We've seen wonderspsikers bending reality, the neverborn spilling from wounded space, yet the imperial truth brands them aberrations to be purged. What fear drives such denial? What if the power he wields is but a fragment of what truly stirs beyond the veil? Each word was a thread, delicately stitching Lorgar's raw anguish into a new pattern, not destruction, but revelation. They did not demand. They coaxed, tailored their poison as antidote. When Lorgar rasped of betrayal, they spoke of trials of purifying doubt. When he choked on worthlessness, they recounted the billions whose souls still echoed his teachings. They never mentioned rebellion. Never whispered of heresy. They spoke only of truth incomplete, obscured, waiting to be sought with courage the Emperor himself lacked. Gradually, like the slow reanimation of a corpse beneath lightning, Lorgar stirred. He emerged from his chambers gaunt but febrile, eyes no longer hollow but burning with a dangerous, unstable light. At the Legion's first assembly, his voice wasn't the thunderous instrument of prophecy they remembered, but a blade honed to a wire's edge. We were mistaken, he admitted to the ranks of silent warriors, their armor still bearing faint scuffs from monarchia's dust. But error is not failure not if we learn. Our purpose remains to seek truth. The galaxy hides more than dusty compliance in the lies of convenient rationality. We will find it, we will understand. The word-bearers listened, and where his words faltered, their shame provided fertile soil. For some, the quest offered redemption, a way to claw dignity from disgrace. For others, a validation of their smoldering rage carefully redirected away from the father who'd spurned them, toward darker, hungrier entities whose existence might justify their suffering. Outwardly, the Legion transformed. Hymns became battle cant. Chaplains traded censers for Volkite chargers. Conquests accelerated, brutal efficiency replacing grand rituals. Worlds burned faster, with chilling professionalism. Reports to Terra brimmed with obedient metrics, compliance tallies swelling, all mentions of divinity scoured from dispatches. The custods, golden and silent atop their watchful balconies, saw only perfect conformity. Beneath that ice, however, a river of shadow flowed. Lorgar's private librarium became a sanctum of forbidden inquiry. Texts salvaged from Nostromo's black markets, Ulthway's abandoned outposts, and the buried vaults of dead empires piled high. Treatises on warp resonance, fragmented accounts of pre-DAOT encounters with elemental intelligences, Colchision folios encoded with sigils that pulsed faintly under candlelight. His quill moved again, not in prayer but in dissection, cross-referencing myths, dissecting imperial lies. He noted how navigators whispered prayers to their astral benefactors. How Fenrisian rune priests denied sorcery while channeling tempests. How the Emperor's own Genisons Magnus especialidanced with powers their father forbade them to name. He understood then. This denial wasn't wisdom, it was control. A gag order on the cosmos, a demand that humanity grope blindly past the hungry dark while the throne waged war on truth itself. But if gods exist, if they can be understood, embraced, the serrated sun's selection was Lorgar's first true act of heresy. Ostensibly, they were punitive detachment, exiled to fringe patrols for residual zealotry. In truth, they were missionaries scouting an uncharted path. Their penitence oaths were litanies of longing, their armor etched with verses from the Lectio Divinitatis filed away, replaced by older, sharper sigils learned from Colchision relics. Erebus himself led them, the finest of his chaplain knights at his back. Their official seal bore the seal of the 13th expedition, their true path charted toward guttering stars where Vox records spoke of cities worshipping the drowned ones, where derelicts drifted with hulls warped into geometries that wounded the eye. And amidst it all, the custods watched, blind. For who would suspect fervor in a legion now so coldly efficient? Who would hear prayers in the click of bolter drills, or see worship in the execution of Xeno's infants under the aegis of imperial compliance? Lorgar's great deception lay in his authenticity. The grief was real, the devotion redirected, the fury sublimated. Monarchia's ashes didn't birth contrived villainy, but twisted revelation. He stood once more on the Fidelitas Lex's bridge, staring into the warp's swirling wound beyond the Gellar fields. The Emperor's face lingered in that phosphorescent chaos not as a god, but as a gatekeeper guarding humanity from truths it deserved to wield. Lorgar would not worship this jailer. He would storm the prison, seize the keys, and kneel before powers who welcomed his devotion as the storm welcomes lightning. In the void where his faith had died, new dark grew, patient and vast, unfurling tendrils of destiny through his wounded heart. The pilgrimage had begun. The change crept through the ranks of the word-bearers like a subtle poison, an insidious realignment of purpose that went unnoticed by all save those who had once shared the Legion's unwavering certainty. Where before there had been the bright, unyielding fire of faith in the Emperor's truth, now smoldered the restless flicker of doubt, hungry and searching. Eyes that had scanned the stars with missionary zeal now darted like scavengers seeking carrion, probing the shadows between known constellations for hidden nourishment. The warriors spoke less of the imperial creed, their voices hushed in corridors where they once sang hymns of conquest, and more of whispered secrets exchanged in the gloom of battle barge chapels repurposed into chambers of forbidden study. Faith had not abandoned them, it had merely shifted its weight, transferred its burden from a silent god who had scorned their devotion to the tantalizing possibility of deities who might embrace them. This quiet metamorphosis culminated on the eve of the serrated sun's departure, when Lorgar gathered his most trusted apostles Coryphaus and Aquilin Arabus in the obsidian-walled sanctum deep within the Fidelitas Lex. No chronicle preserved the words uttered in those final, fateful hours. No scribe recorded the oaths sworn in the flickering light of censers that scented the air with Miran incense. Yet when the Primarch emerged to address the chosen warriors who would spearhead the expedition, those assembled saw a transformation as stark as sun-scorched stone. Gone was the haunted weight that had bowed his shoulders since Monarchia. His bearing radiated a renewed ferocity, a clarity that burned cold and terrible in his golden iced look of a predator, scenting blood on an unexpected wind. The serrated sun chapter departed in calculated motions, their fleet a wedge of sanctified plasteel slipping silently into the warp maw. To the watching legions Astartes on the muster decks, it seemed routine, another compliance operation assigned with brusque efficiency by the Crown Prince Rogel Dorn. Yet Lorgar, returning to his duties as leader of the word-bearers, moved through the familiar rhythms of war with an alien composure, a stillness masking tectonic shifts beneath. Outwardly, the Legion marched in lockstep with the Great Crusade, tallying compliant worlds with brutal efficiency, their methodologies copied dutifully from Gilliman's optimized playbooks. Compliance reports flowed to Terra in pristine rows of high Gothic script, each consonant clipped to perfection. But within the blood-stained chapels of the 17th, beneath the frescoed domes obliterated, and now hastily repainted with glowering, ambiguous saints, the word-bearers whispered litanies to absent gods. Chaplains observed sacred vigils, not for the absent emperor, but for the promised revelation of Coryphaus, expedition for news that would validate this hollow ache beneath their breastplates, this screaming absence where purpose had once blazed. The stars themselves seemed altered to the warriors of the serrated sun chapter, as their vessels carved through the void into the wild galactic east, along paths untraceable on the Mechanicum star charts. Constellations narrowed like half-lidded eyes, watching their trespass. The 5 custodians of the Aquiland shield assigned to the fleet moved through the battle barge halls with soft, golden menace, ignorant of the currents swirling beneath the Legion's veneer of duty. Their unwavering vigilance, attuned to treachery and physical threat, failed to grasp the spiritual rot metastasizing in the Legion's marrow. The fleet's nominal mission expansion, compliance, promulgation of the Imperial truth echoed hollow as a struck drum through muster chambers where grey-robed iterators no longer drew crowds. Instead, trusted officers pored over cipher-locked manuscripts in hidden decks, Xeno's star maps salvaged from forgotten Cascan reliquaries, scrolls exhumed from librarious oubliettes. Navigators bound by blood oaths to Lorgar's vision scoured the Immaterium's tides for currents leading not to terra firma, but to realms where reality frayed like rotten silk. Astropaths, their eyes sewn shut with threads of silver, strained against edicts forbidding communion with the warp's whispers, decoding choruses in the static that no sane mind would acknowledge. When the navigator Primaris reported a cataclysmic warp storm pulsating on the far edge of detectable Spatian abomination, no prudent captain would approach Coryphaus, did not convene a war council, but withdrew into meditative solitude for 3 solar days, communing with the Aurelian's distant voice via artifices unknown. His order upon exiting was issued without consultation with the custodians. The fleet would adjust course toward the storm. Ancient Colchissian axioms murmured in the archives declared Tempest's divine portents. To the seekers of concealed truths, it shone like lodestone beckoning them home. The unnamed star system swam into Auspec's range, stained raw by the warp's touch, its G-class sun a sickly sibling to Terra's. The 4th planet, logged as 130,112, offered no outward resistancino energy signatures, no orbital defenses. Its surface sprawled verdant beneath wisps of cloud, a mosaic of viridian forests, ochre highlands, and glittering sapphire lakes. Yet the moment the fleet's sensors brushed its atmosphere, the astropathic choir screamed in dissonant harmony. The warp surged around the system in crashing waves, not the mindless roar of the ether, but something structure at a million voices chanting in dead languages, polyphonic hymns praising entities whose true names scoured the soul bare. Coryphaus himself reported whispers threading into his thoughts, an intimacy that bypassed his transhuman mental bulwarks and tarlipromises of purpose, of validation, of a love that would smother his father's condemnation like a shroud. The custodians, sensing heresy like blood salts on the air, demanded immediate withdrawal. They were outmaneuvered by Legion protocols older than the Imperium itself. The landing on world 130,112, destined to be christened Cadia by those who survived, was stagecraft, wrapped in procedural legitimacy. Word-bearers selected for psychic acuity descended alongside the custodial honor guard, rank upon rank of Ivoric-led automata from the Legio Cybernetica, and mortal soldiers drafted from the Geno 77 cohort. They touched down on a grassy plain ribbed with standing stones, the sky bruised violet by the vast, unending storm that churned perpetually above the northern horizon. First contact began without ceremony. The native humans emerged from forest shade, attired in furs and rough-spun cloth, unarmed and eerily poised beneath the guns of demigods. Their eyes gleamed uniformly amethyst, reflecting the tempest above an affliction later generations would dread as the mark of warp touch. A woman strode forward, her gait regal despite her primitive garb. She ignored the custodians and their unsheathed guardian spears, addressing Coryphaus by his hidden Colchissian baptismal name, larger a secret known only to sworn brothers. The custodian Varath Valerian, his golden plate reflecting stormlight in jagged shards, demanded immediate purgation. Primitives with such knowledge were cancer incarnate. Coryphaus halted his blade mid-swing with a voxcrawl. This was no accident, he declared, but revelation itself, manifest in the flesh. Ingethiled woman who met them became prophet and guide. She led them through landscapes that defied mundane scrutiny. Stone circles hummed with harmonic resonance when the stormlight struck them at certain angles, their monoliths aligned with stars dead for millennia. Caves exhaled breaths warmer than the surrounding air, their walls shimmering with fungal bioluminescence, arranged in fractals matching celestial patterns burned into Legion Apothecarian data slates. Groves of blackbark trees grew in logarithmic spirals, roots entwining around crystalline formations humming with subsonic vibrations. At each site, Ingethil whispered truths that transformed doubt into rapturous certainty. She spoke of beings beyond the veil, ancient as the void itself, entities who had shepherded mankind's infancy not from callous disinterest, but from a love too vast for mortal comprehension. Their names, she intoned, had been etched onto human souls since the species' first faltering steps. Munog the Weaver, Kabanda of the Burning Heart, Lun the Silent Watcher. To the word bearers, it was ecstasy. This was no delusion, it was archaeology of the divine, evidence scoured clean of the Emperor's lies. The custodians chronicled every interaction in autoquill dispatches choked with censure, their pleas for intervention lost in the backlogged astropathic relays of the burgeoning crusade. By the time their warnings reached Terra, the rot had already gorged itself on Corifau's soul. Ingethil's final gift demanded ritual ceremony to pierce reality's skin and reveal the writhing divinity beneath. Preparations unfolded in a volcanic basin, flanked by basalt columns carved with glyphs older than the Legion itself. Mortal auxiliaries hauled censers billowing narcotic incense, while Corifaus inscribed Enuncia sigils onto Ingethil's brow with a blade honed on Null City marble. The custodians protested, their warnings drowned beneath the thrumming chords the word-bearers chanted a hymn retrieved from Calchas's deepest vaults. As the moon's bruised face crested the horizon, Ingethil stepped into the ritual circle. The air around her wrenched itself inside out, colors bleeding across spectrums that seared retinal implants. Her flesh rippled like molten glass before solidifying into a new elongated limbs twined with warpfare, eyes eclipsed by pulsing black voids, a corona of singing blades orbiting her brow. In this ascended form, she introduced herself as Egrethiel the Gatekeeper, her voice bypassing ears to vibrate in the marrow. Diabolical intelligence pulsed from her, a beacon tearing through the veil. There were gods waiting in the storm, she promised, entities longing to embrace those forsaken by the Golden Tyrant. To find them, however, required passage through the eye of the abyss itself. Oro's Lament, a Stormclass frigate crewed solely by legionaries purified through rites of disfiguration, plunged into the tempest without log entry or farewell transmission. Within the warpstorm's grip, reality crumbled like wet clay. Bulkheads wept viscous fluid that tasted of regret when touched to the tongue. Graph plating inverted, forcing the crew to navigate ceilings as decks inverted. Stars outside the viewports became screaming faces pressed against the glass. Navigators dispatched by Corifaus guided the ship down psychic currents smelling of burnt hair and primed with the ozone-sharp tang of ascendant divinity. They emerged not in real space, but in a subrealm of pure nightmareth crone worlds, scattered husks cracked open like rotten fruit across a demon sea. Once the glittering heart of the Eldari Dominion, now they smoldered in perpetual twilight, their spires bent into spirals that induced seizures in unmodified humans, their ruins vibrating with the psychic residue of a trillion murders. Egrethiel led the word-bearers through ashen wastelands scabbed with the wreckage of Godingens, pointing to petrified Eldar corpses frozen mid-ecstasy, mouths forever yawning in silent anthems to their own extinction. She showed them shattered temples where thousands had once knelt to entities whose names curdled the blood, and in the weeping cracks of those ruins, Corifaus saw reflections of Calchas Bernadnot raised by Gilliman's ultramarines, but laid waste by its own children in delirious adulation. Not damnation, Egrethiel corrected gently, tearing an obsidian shard from an altar crusted with psychic bilemurally transubstantiation. The Emperor sought to chain mankind to carnal stagnation. The primordial truth offered evolution beyond the prison of flesh, apotheosis through surrender. On Cadia, Corifaus received the frigate's encrypted logs, the pick captures of what lay within the storm's heart, and wept not in horror but in gratitude. While the custodians raged, demanding the Legion's censure, Corifaus ordered Cadia unscarred. Not a single tree burned, no tribal blood spilled. When the fleet translated back into the Imperial fold, compliance tallies in hand, they bore 2 truthzone for the Emperor's archivists, another buried like a seed in the Legion's soul. The scattered whispers began almost immediately. In the quiet between warp jumps, word-bearers exchanged furtive glances, fingers brushing newly carved sigils beneath their battleplate. Memorial hymns took on doubled meanings, rehearsed before the hollowed stares of chaplains who now preached from texts unseen by mortal eyes since before Old Night. The road to Istvan V stretched long and bloody ahead, but here, under Cadia's churning sky, the first steps were taken not in defiance, but in raptureth surrender of blind loyalty for the glorious damnation of revelation. Inth revealed to the crew the story of these worlds and the civilization that had inhabited them. The Eldari, she explained, had once ruled the galaxy as unchallenged masters, their psychic powers and technological achievements elevating them to godlike status. But in their pride and decadence, they had fallen, not through external conquest, but through their own actions, their excesses and indulgences, creating a buildup of psychic energy in the warp that eventually erupted in catastrophic birth. At birth, the creation of a new warp entity from the collective psychic imprint of an entire species had torn reality apart, creating the very storm through which they now traveled. This entity, this newborn god of pleasure and excess, had consumed most of the Eldari at the moment of its awakening, dragging their souls into torment while ripping their home worlds into the warp. But Ingthel's account differed in crucial ways from the truth, as the Imperium would later understand it. She presented the fall of the Eldari not as a cautionary tale, but as a model of transcendence, a species ascending beyond physical limitations through union with warp entities, achieving a form of apathua even as their material civilization collapsed. The Isle Diary had failed in her telling, not because they had embraced chaos, but because they had recalled from it at the crucial moment, unable to accept the transformation their actions had set in motion. Humanity, she suggested, faced a similar crossroads. Like the Eldari before them, humans possessed psychic potential and creative capacities that connected them to the warp. They could embrace this connection, work with the entities that dwelled in that other realm and achieve their own form of ascension, or they could deny it as the Emperor insisted and eventually face destruction from the very forces they refused to acknowledge. This narrative struck deep chords within the wordbearers who heard it. They recognized in Ingthel's words an explanation for the Emperor's actions, his insistence on the imperial truth, his denial of the supernatural, his punishment of those who sought divine connection. He was not merely enforcing rationalism, but actively preventing humanity from achieving its true potential, keeping mankind imprisoned in a purely material existence when transcendence beckoned. More personal was the realization that Lorgar had been right all along. Not in worshipping the Emperor, but in recognizing the reality of divine powers and humanity's need to engage with them. His error had been in the object of worship, not in the act itself. The Primarch, who had been humiliated at Monarchia, was vindicated by the revelations within the storm, his spiritual sensitivity proven more accurate than the Emperor's enforced materialism. As the Oreo's lament continued its journey through the Crone worlds, the crew witnessed sights that would have broken lesser minds, cities where architecture obeyed emotional rather than physical laws, oceans of substances that responded to thought, ruins that rearranged themselves when not directly observed. They encountered entities that could only be described as demons, though Ingirth presented them as potential allies, beings of pure thought and emotion who could grant power and knowledge in exchange for worship and sacrifice. Throughout this journey, the transformation of the wordbearers continued. Warriors who had once served the Emperor with unswerving loyalty now began to see him as a tyrant, a false guide leading humanity away from its true path. The religious impulse that had been directed toward him was redirected toward the entities Ingth revealed, gods of change, of war, of pleasure, of decay, each representing an aspect of existence the Emperor had taught them to deny. When the Oreo's lament finally emerged from the warp storm, its crew were changed beings, not physically for the most part, but spiritually and psychologically. They carried within them knowledge forbidden by imperial decree, experiences that could not be reconciled with the imperial truth, and a burning conviction that the Emperor had betrayed humanity by denying the reality of the warp and its inhabitants. They returned to the main fleet with their minds afire, eager to share what they had learned to spread the truth that would liberate their brothers from the Emperor's deception. The seeds of heresy planted in the ashes of Monarchia had bloomed in the light of the warp storm into poisonous flowers, whose fragrance would soon intoxicate an entire legion. The knowledge brought back by the Oreo's lament spread quickly through the ranks of the Serrated Sun chapter, transmitted through a combination of written accounts, personal testimony, and ritual practices designed to open perception to warp influences. Warriors who had been raised to revere the Emperor now learned to see him as an obstacle to human advancement, a tyrant whose secular dogma kept mankind from achieving its true potential through union with the warp. For the custodians who witnessed these developments, the situation had become untenable. Their duty was clear to report this corruption, and if possible eliminate its source before it could spread further. But they found themselves isolated on distant Cadia, outnumbered by Astarte, whose loyalty had been compromised with no reliable means of communicating with terror or summoning reinforcement. One by one, they were quietly eliminated, their deaths arranged to appear as accidents or the results of skirmishes with native fauna. With the last external witnesses removed, Corran made a decision that would shape the future of the 17th Legion and ultimately the Imperium itself. Cadia, with its population so clearly connected to the powers of the warp, represented both an opportunity and a threat, a potential base for future operations, but also evidence that could expose the Wordbearers' new allegiance before they were ready to declare it openly. The planet would have to be cleansed, its population, and all trace of their culture eliminated to preserve the secrecy of what had been discovered. The bombardment of Cadia was thorough, cyclonic torpedoes reducing cities to ash. Conventional munitions scouring the countryside of all human habitation. The purple-eyed people who had welcomed the Wordbearers and shown them the path to new gods died by the millions, their knowledge and traditions seemingly erased from the galaxy. Only when sensors confirmed no human life signs remaining did the fleet withdraw, setting course back toward the heart of the Imperium, with their newfound knowledge burning in their minds. What none aboard those departing vessels could know was that their actions had not eliminated the influence of chaos from Cadia, but merely driven it underground. In future millennia, the planet would be resettled by Imperial colonists who would, by some quirk of genetics or warp influence, develop the same distinctive purple eyes as the population they had exterminated. Cadia would become a fortress world, guarding the entrance to the Eye of Terror. Its people renowned for their military prowess and devotion to the Emperor, an irony that would have pleased the dark gods who had first claimed that world as their own. The news from Cadia reached Lorgar aboard his flagship, delivered in coded transmissions that spoke of revelations and pathways of gods who answered prayer and truths hidden beyond the veil of material existence. As he read the carefully worded reports, something stirred within the Primarch's breast, a deep yearning that had lived in his heart since childhood. The possibility that he might at last find beings worthy of his devotion, entities who would not reject his worship, but welcome it, filled him with a trembling anticipation he had not felt since the days before Monarchia. In the privacy of his meditation chamber, surrounded by the remnants of his old faith, books of prayer now sealed away, devotional objects hidden from Imperial observers, Lorgar made his decision. He would see these truths with his own eyes, experience these revelations directly rather than through second-hand accounts. The Primarch, who had once built cathedrals to the Emperor, would venture into the realm where gods truly dwelled, would kneel before them if they proved worthy, would judge for himself whether the faith so brutally stripped from him might find new and more deserving objects. The journey was arranged with utmost secrecy. A small vessel, unmarked and unremarkable, departed from the Fidelitas Lex, with minimal crew, only those most trusted, those whose loyalty to Lorgar stronger than any oath to the Imperium. The Primarch traveled without ceremony or entourage, a pilgrim rather than a lord seeking truth rather than commanding it. As their ship slipped into the warp, Lorgar felt the familiar disorientation of transition. But this time, rather than closing his mind against the whispers that always haunted these journeys, he opened himself to them, listening for patterns in what he had been taught to dismiss as meaningless noise. What he heard changed him. The voices that reached through the warp spoke directly to his deepest needs, his hunger for meaning, his desire for connection, his longing to serve something greater than himself. They knew him. These entities knew him more intimately than the father who had rejected him. They spoke with seductive understanding, offering not rebuke, but acceptance, not limitation, but possibility. When his vessel emerged into the swirling energies of the Eye of Terror, Lorgar stood transfixed before the viewing portal, golden tears streaming down his face. The realm before him was beautiful in its terrible way, a place where reality obeyed thought rather than physical law, where emotions shaped matter, where the boundaries that constrained mortal existence dissolved into infinite potential. Here was a dimension where faith was not merely belief but power, where worship created tangible connection between divinity and deity. Under the guidance of those who had traversed this realm before, Lorgar was taken to places of revelation, shattered worlds where ancient temples still stood, their architecture impossible by material standards, yet perfect in emotional resonance, voids between worlds where entities of pure concept dwelled, beings that represented the fundamental forces of creation and destruction. Hidden places where the veil between realities had worn so thin that a mortal mind could perceive the true nature of the universe unfiltered by the limitations of physical senses. In these places, Lorgar learned truths that the Emperor had concealed from his children. He learned of the four great powers, entities of such vast scope that God was the only adequate term, beings that had existed since the dawn of sentient life and would endure until its end. He learned of their aspects and domains, change and hope, warfare and honor, pleasure and perfection, decay and renewal. He learned that these powers responded to worship, growing stronger through the faith directed toward them, entering into relationship with those who acknowledged their existence. Most crucially, Lorgar learned of humanity's unique position in the cosmic order. Unlike other species, humans possessed a particular resonance with the warp, a potential for psychic development that connected them intimately with the realm beyond material existence. This connection could be denied or suppressed, as the Emperor sought to do, but such denial went against the species' evolutionary destiny. True advancement, true transcendence lay not in rejection of the warp, but in embracing it, in forging conscious partnership with the entities that dwelled there. The Emperor knew this truth, had always known it, lagered with growing bitterness. His father had not forbidden religious worship out of devotion to rational truth, but out of fear and jealousy, a desire to keep humanity bound to his vision, rather than allowing them to forge direct connection with greater powers. The imperial truth was not enlightenment, but chains, not wisdom, but deliberate blindness imposed by a being who demanded loyalty while offering only rejection in return. As these realizations crystallized in Lorgar's mind, something broke within him. The last remnants of his devotion to the Emperor, the lingering hope that there might be reconciliation between them. In its place grew a new certainty, a new purpose. Humanity must be liberated from the Emperor's deception, must be guided toward its true potential through communion with the warp entities his father had taught them to fear. And Lorgar, with his unique sensitivity to spiritual matters, his gift for inspiring devotion, was the perfect instrument for this grand conversion. The beings of the warp, the chaos gods, though Lorgar did not yet fully embrace this term, recognized his potential and responded accordingly. They showed him visions of possible futures, a humanity ascendant, evolved beyond physical limitation, through partnership with warp entities, a civilization spanning dimensions rather than merely stars, where death was not an end but a transition, where the boundaries that constrained mortal existence dissolved into glorious infinity. These visions filled Lorgar with purpose, the humiliation of monarchia, the rejection of his devotion. These were not punishments but necessary steps on his journey, painful initiations that had freed him from false worship and opened him to greater truths. He had been broken so that he might be rebuilt, had lost his faith so that he might find a deeper and more worthy one. The gods had not abandoned him. They had been waiting for him all along, guiding his path through suffering toward enlightenment. When Lorgar finally returned to his legion, those closest to him noticed the change immediately. The uncertainty that had haunted him since monarchia was gone, replaced by a serene conviction that bordered on the unsettling. His golden eyes held a new light, not the bright flame of his old religious fervor, but something deeper and more knowing, a gleam that suggested he had gazed upon mysteries beyond mortal comprehension and been transformed by the experience. The orders he issued upon his return reflected this transformation. First and most urgent was the complete destruction of Cadia, the world that had served as gateway to revelation. Though the initial cleansing had been thorough, Lorgar insisted on more. Cyclonic torpedoes to scour the surface, virus bombs to eliminate any possibility of biological remnants, systematic erasure of all records relating to the original population. Nothing could remain that might lead others to discover what the wordbearers had found before they were ready to share this knowledge. With Cadia reduced to lifeless rock, attention turned to the Legion itself. Outwardly, Lorgar issued commands that seemed to align perfectly with the Emperor's expectations. Increased pace of conquest, adherence to secular imperial compliance protocols, cessation of all visible religious practices. The wordbearers would become model soldiers of the Imperium, their previous deviations apparently corrected, their problematic tendencies seemingly overcome. This apparent reformation was reported to Terror with appropriate documentation. Conquest tallies rising, compliance protocols followed to the letter, worlds brought into the Imperial fold. The observers assigned to monitor the 17th Legion noted the changes with cautious approval, sending back assessments that suggested Lorgar had indeed learned from his censure and altered his Legion's behavior accordingly. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Behind this facade of compliance, a complete transformation was underway. Lorgar gathered his most trusted sons, Corran, Arabus, and others who had shown receptivity to the new teachings, and shared with them the full extent of what he had learned within the Eye of Terror. He spoke of the primordial truth, the reality of divine powers that existed beyond material limitations, the destiny that awaited humanity if it embraced rather than feared the warp. These chosen few became the nucleus of a new priesthood within the wordbearers. Tasked with carefully spreading these teachings throughout the Legion, the process was necessarily gradual, with warriors selected individually for initiation based on their psychological profiles and spiritual inclinations. Some embraced the new faith immediately, recognizing in it the fulfillment of longings they had harbored since their first induction into the Legion. Others required more careful handling, their indoctrination proceeding through subtle stages as old loyalties were weakened and new ones cultivated. A rare few proved resistant to the new teachings, their devotion to the Emperor and the imperial truth too deeply ingrained to be overwritten. These unfortunates met with accidents during combat operations or were assigned to isolated duty posts where their influence could not spread or simply disappeared during warp transit, their names gradually erased from Legion records. The wordbearers were being purified, remade as vessels for a new kind of faith, one that would transform not just themselves but eventually all humanity. As this internal transformation proceeded, the outward face of the Legion changed as well. The Wordbearers embraced their new role as exemplary Imperial warriors with apparent enthusiasm, their conquest tallies rising dramatically, their compliance actions executed with textbook precision. Where once they had lingered over worlds for years, ensuring complete cultural conversion, now they moved with almost reckless speed, bringing planet after planet into the Imperial fold through swift and decisive action. The Wordbearers themselves underwent more direct transformation. In secret gatherings held in the depths of their vessels, far from the eyes of Imperial observers, they embraced the worship of the Chaos Gods in their undivided aspect. New rituals replaced the old ceremonies of Emperor worship. Blood sacrifices conducted where once incense had burned, prayers directed to entities their father had taught them to deny. The Legion that had once been the most devoutly loyal to the Emperor became the most comprehensively corrupted, their faith transferred wholesale from one object to another. As the Wordbearers spread through the galaxy, apparently exemplary servants of the Imperium while secretly advancing the cause of chaos, Lorgar turned his attention to a more ambitious project, the corruption of his brother Primarchs. If humanity was to be freed from the Emperor's deception, it would not be enough to subvert individual worlds or even a single legion. The power structures of the Imperium itself would have to be turned against their creator, and no power within that structure exceeded that of the Primarchs and their legions. Lorgar approached this task with the psychological insight that had always been his greatest strength. He understood his brothers, their desires and fears, their strengths and vulnerabilities, the hidden wounds each carried from their scattered childhoods and complicated relationships with their father. He knew which could be approached directly and which would require more subtle handling, which might be receptive to spiritual arguments, and which would respond only to practical considerations. Most promising as an initial target was Horus Lupercal, the first found and most favored of the Emperor's sons, recently elevated to the position of War Master Raster. This promotion, which placed him in authority over his brothers, had created complicated emotional crosscurrents. Pride in the Emperor's trust, anxiety over the enormous responsibility, concern that he might be seen as placing himself above his equals. More troubling still, the Emperor had withdrawn from direct participation in the Great Crusade to pursue some secret project on Terror, leaving Horus to feel the full weight of command without the guidance he had come to rely upon. These vulnerabilities created openings that Lorgar could exploit, points of emotional leverage where doubt might be introduced and nurtured. Through Erebus, who cultivated a friendship with the War Master's inner circle, subtle influences were brought to bear. Suggestions about the Emperor's true intentions, carefully selected information about the secret project on Terror, hints that the Primarchs were not being told the full truth about their father's plans for humanity's future. Simultaneously, arrangements were made to expose Horus to warp influences that would make him more susceptible to corruption. Ancient artifacts recovered from worlds where chaos worship had long flourished were introduced into his vicinity, their psychic emanations, weakening the barriers between his mind and the warp. Individuals already corrupted by chaos were positioned where they might influence his decisions. Their suggestions seeming reasonable while guiding him toward paths that would lead to his eventual fall. The culmination of this careful preparation came on the moon of Davanin, where Horus was grievously wounded during a compliance action. As he lay near death beyond the help of conventional medicine, Erebus suggested an alternative treatment, a healing ritual practiced by the Davanite lodges, native spiritual organizations that had been secretly corrupted by Wordbearer influence. This ritual, presented as a simple local custom that might succeed where imperial methods had failed, was in fact a carefully designed gateway to chaos influence, opening Horus' mind to direct communication with the Ruinous Powers. Within the ritual trance, Horus experienced visions, some true, some false, all manipulated to lead him toward the conclusion Lorgar desired. He saw possible futures where the Emperor was worshipped as a god while the Primarchs were forgotten, where humanity stagnated under oppressive religious rule, where all they had fought for was perverted into something they had never intended. Most crucially, he was shown a version of history in which the Primarchs were not the Emperor's beloved sons, but merely tools created for a purpose and destined to be discarded once their usefulness ended. These visions, combined with the direct influence of the Chaos Gods offering power and autonomy, broke Horus' loyalty to the Emperor. When he emerged from the healing trance, the Wararm Master was outwardly unchanged but inwardly corrupted. His allegiance transferred from the father who had betrayed him to the new gods who promised partnership rather than servitude. The most powerful military leader in the Imperium, commander of the combined might of all space marine legions, had become an agent of chaos. With Horus turned, attention shifted to other Primarchs who might be brought into the conspiracy. Magnus, the Red of the Thousand Suns, whose psychic abilities and interest in forbidden knowledge made him naturally receptive to certain aspects of chaos. Angren of the World Eaters, whose rage against the Emperor for failing to save his comrades on Utria could be inflamed into outright rebellion. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, whose pursuit of perfection could be twisted towards slannishy excess. Mortarion of the Death Guard, whose stoic endurance of suffering aligned with Nurgle's domains. Conrad Kurds of the Night Lords, whose visions of a dark future could be manipulated to seem inevitable. Parabo of the Iron Warriors, whose resentment at being assigned thankless siege duties, while others claimed glory could be nurtured into bitter hatred. Each required a different approach, a personalized corruption, tailored to their particular vulnerabilities. Some were approached directly, others influenced through their closest advisors. Some fell quickly, their existing grievances against the Emperor requiring only slight encouragement to blossom into outright treachery. Others required more careful handling, their loyalty eroded through series of small compromises rather than a single dramatic break. Throughout this process of corruption, Lorgar maintained a facade of perfect loyalty. His legion continuing its great crusade while secretly undermining everything it stood for. The wordbearers were everywhere, their forces spread across countless war zones, their influence extending into every aspect of Imperial operations. This dispersion allowed them to plant seeds of corruption throughout the Imperium structure in the army, the Mechanicum, the administrative apparatus, even among the Iterator Corps charged with spreading the Imperial truth. As more Primarchs returned and more institutions infiltrated, plans for open rebellion began to take shape. The challenge was immense. Even with half the Space Marines potentially aligned with Horus, the Loyalist forces remained formidable, and the Emperor's own power was incalculable. Victory would require not just military strength, but precise coordination, psychological warfare, and strategic positioning that would prevent Loyalist forces from effectively responding until it was too late. The plan focused on a multi-stage rebellion that would unfold with devastating speed once initiated. First, potentially unreliable elements within the Traitor Legions would be identified and eliminated, ensuring unity of purpose among the forces of chaos. Then a devastating first strike with the Loyalist legions, catching them unprepared and separated from each other. With opposition weakened, a direct assault on terror would follow, aimed at killing the Emperor before he could fully respond to the threat. Lorgar's contribution to this plan went beyond strategy. As the Primarch most attuned to spiritual matters, he understood that this conflict would be waged not just in the material realm, but in the warp as well. The Ruinous Powers would need to be strengthened through ritual and sacrifice. Their influence expanded through worship, their access to real space, facilitated through the breaking of psychic barriers. The rebellion against the Emperor would not simply be a political or military coup, but a fundamental transformation of reality itself. The beginning of a new age where the boundaries between material and immaterial dissolved, where gods walked among mortals, where humanity achieved its true potential through union with the warp. This vision sustained Lorgar through the complex preparations for rebellion, through the careful corruption of his brothers, through the establishment of cults across countless worlds. When doubt crept in, moments when he remembered the father he had once worshipped, when he questioned whether the path he had chosen was truly right, he returned to the certainty he had found within the Eye of Terror. The revelation that the Emperor's path led only to stagnation, while the primordial truth offered transcendence. In his private moments, Lorgar sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The child found on Koi's raised to believe in divine powers, the young leader who had united a world under the banner of religious truth, the devoted son who had worshipped the Emperor as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy, the broken Primarch kneeling in the ashes of monarchia, the pilgrim who had ventured into the Eye of Terror seeking gods worthy of his devotion. And now the architect of a rebellion that would transform humanity forever. Each stage had been necessary, each suffering a step toward enlightenment, each apparent defeat actually a victory drawing him closer to his true purpose. As the final pieces of the grand conspiracy fell into place, and the time for open rebellion drew near, Lorgar felt not the anxiety of a traitor, but the serene certainty of a prophet. He had found his truth, had embraced his destiny, had aligned himself with powers greater and more worthy than the father who had rejected him. The 17th Legion, once the most loyal servants of the Emperor, had become the most dedicated agents of his undoing. And when the galaxy burned in the fires of civil war from those purifying flames, would emerge a new humanity, transformed, ascended, united with the divine powers that had waited so patiently for their children to return home. In the cold void between the stars, far from prying eyes, a vessel of unprecedented scale took shape. The furious abyss was a monument to vengeance, a physical manifestation of hatred nursed over long years. As the dark metal of its hull plates fused together in the shipyards hidden on the Jovian moon of Thur, the wordbearers who oversaw its construction felt their hearts swell with anticipation. This ship would carry their retribution to those who had humiliated them, who had stood in pristine blue armor, watching as their dreams burned to ash on distant monarchia. The creation of such a vessel could not be hidden entirely. Of course, resources had to be diverted, specialists contracted, supply lines established. But the word-bearers had learned much about deception in the years since their fall. False documentation obscured the ship's true purpose, suggesting it was an experimental prototype, one of many vessels being developed to strengthen the Imperium's naval capabilities. Those who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned to distant posts or meeting with unfortunate accidents. The Dark Mechanicum adepts who supervised the technical aspects were already sworn to Horus's cause, their loyalty to Mars replaced by devotion to darker powers. For the workers who labored on its construction, there was something unsettling about the Furious Abyss. Its proportions felt somehow wrong, its angles creating optical illusions that strained the eye, its corridors arranged in patterns that seemed to serve ritual rather than practical purposes. Strange sounds echoed through its developing skeleton, chants and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, metallic groans that resembled words in forgotten languages. Those who spent too long within its depths reported nightmares, waking visions, a sense of being watched by hungry eyes. These effects were not accidents but design features. Throughout the ship's construction, Wordbearer's Dark Apostles conducted rituals in its growing chambers, consecrating each section to the Ruinous Powers, inscribing hidden sigils beneath floor plates and behind wall panels, sacrificing slaves at key junctures to infuse the very metal with warp energies. The Furious Abyss would be more than a vessel of war. It would be a temple in motion, a cathedral dedicated to vengeance, its every atom aligned with the will of chaos. As the ship neared completion, selected crews began their training. These were devotees, cultists who had embraced the Wordbearer's new faith, warriors who had nursed grudges against the Ultramarines since the humiliation at Monarchia. They learned not just the technical operation of the vessel, but the rituals that would maintain its unholy consecration, the prayers that would keep it connected to the warp, the sacrifices required to feed the entities that had infused its structure. Their training took place in isolation, ensuring that none who knew the ship's true purpose would have opportunity to warn its intended victims. The commanding officer chosen for this mission was Zadkiel, a captain whose outward demeanor of cold professionalism concealed a burning hatred for Gilliman and his legion. Zadkiel had been present at Monarchia, had knelt in the ashes of the perfect city, had felt the Emperor's psychic command force him to his knees in humiliation. That memory had festered in him, transforming from hot rage to cold purpose. His every action since that day, directed toward the moment when he could repay that humiliation in kind. His selection as commander of the Furious Abyss was culmination of that purpose, the instrument of vengeance placed at last within his grasp. The mission given to Zadkiel was both simple in concept and complex in execution. Prevent the Ultramarines from interfering with Horus' assault on Terror. The 13th Legion represented the largest single military force in the Imperium, their numbers exceeding even the combined strength of several other legions. If they reached Terror intact during Horus's attack, their intervention could tip the balance against the Warm Master's forces. They had to be neutralized, or at minimum delayed, until the crucial battles had been decided. This objective meshed perfectly with the Wordbearer's desire for revenge. The legion that had been the instrument of their humiliation would now suffer humiliation in turn, their vaunted realm of Ultramar devastated. Their home world of Macrags reduced to rubble, their Primarch killed or captured before he could come to the Emperor's aid. What had been planned as a strategic necessity became infused with personal hatred, the military objective overlaid with emotional cathosis. The Furious Abyss would lead a fleet directly to Macragge, bypassing the outlying systems of Ultramar, striking at the heart of Gilliman's realm in a surprise attack that would the Legion's command structure. Simultaneously, a second force led by Cor Farron would engage the bulk of the Ultramarines' fleet at Caf, ostensibly for military exercises, but actually to pin them in place while the Furious Abyss completed its mission. With their Primarch dead and their fleet engaged, the Ultramarines would be unable to respond effectively when news of Horus's rebellion finally reached them. What made this plan particularly elegant was its timing. The attack would be launched before news of Horus's betrayal had spread. While the Ultramarines still believed the Wordbearers to be loyal allies, the military exercises at Caf would seem routine, one legion coordinating with another, as they had countless times during the Great Crusade. By the time Gilman realized the true nature of the threat, it would be too late. His legion caught in a trap, his realm burning, his path to terror blocked by enemies he had thought were brothers. As the Furious Abyss slipped from its construction cradle and began its maiden voyage, those aboard felt the weight of destiny upon them. They were not simply embarking on a military mission, but participating in a pivotal moment of history, the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the galaxy. What none aboard realized was that their mission had already been compromised. The Furious Abyss's first kill, The Ultramarines vessel, Fist of Macragge, destroyed as it headed for repairs, had managed to send a psychic warning before its destruction. This warning, received as a powerful telepathic scream at the Vangelis spaceport, alerted a group of Ultramarines led by Captain Cestus to the Wordbearer's treachery. Though they did not yet understand the full scope of the betrayal, they gathered a small fleet of loyal vessels and set out in pursuit of the mysterious aggressor. The resulting void battle was desperate and one-sided. The Furious Abyss, designed specifically for devastating naval combat, outclassed the smaller vessels that attempted to stop it. One by one, the loyal ships were destroyed, their sacrifice seemingly in vain as the massive Wordbearer's vessel continued toward Macragge's. Only the Ultramarines' ship Wrathful and the Fireblade survived the initial engagement, following the Furious Abyss into the warp in a last desperate attempt to prevent it from reaching its target. Even this full hope seemed to fail when a psionic mine deployed by the Wordbearers caused the Fireblade's Jeller field to collapse, exposing the ship and its crew to the raw madness of the warp. The demonic entities that rushed in to feast upon the unprotected souls left nothing behind. Not even wreckage that might serve as warning to others. The Wrathful, temporarily separated from its quarry, seemed to represent the last slim chance of alerting Macragge to the coming threat. While the Furious Abyss continued its journey toward Macragge, the second phase of the Wordbearer's plan was already in motion. At Caf, a significant portion of the Ultramarines' Legion had gathered for what they believed to be joint military exercises with their Wordbearer's cousins. Ships from both legions moved into position around the planet. Warriors were deployed to the surface. Command protocols established between the supposedly allied forces all appeared normal, routine, a standard procedure repeated countless times during the Great Crusade. Leading the Wordbearer's contingent was Cor Farron, first captain and spiritual advisor to Lorgar, now a devoted servant of chaos. His ship, renamed Infidus Imperator, False Emperor, in a blasphemous rejection of his former loyalties, served as command center for the gathered Wordbearer's fleet. From its stratagem, Cor Farron monitored the deployment of forces, ensuring that his warriors were positioned to maximize the coming slaughter. His expression a mask of collegial professionalism that concealed the anticipation building within his breast. The signal to begin the betrayal came without warning. Throughout the system, Wordbearer's vessels opened fire on their Ultramarine counterparts, catching many with void shields down, weapons unpowered, crews unprepared for hostilities from those they considered brothers. Simultaneously, Wordbearer's forces on Cal's surface turned on their allies, gunning down Ultramarines in the midst of joint maneuvers, transforming training grounds into killing fields, assembly areas into ambush zones. The initial attack was devastating. Dozens of Ultramarines' vessels were destroyed in the opening minutes, their crews having no chance to respond to the unexpected treachery. On the surface, thousands of Astartes in blue armor fell to perfectly positioned ambushes, cut down by bolter fire from warriors they had stood beside moments before. Yet, for all its careful planning, the attack was not an unqualified success. The Ultramarines, though surprised, responded well. Ships that survived the initial bombardment quickly raised void shields and returned fire, captains adapting to the changed situation with remarkable speed. On the ground, scattered Ultramarine units rallied around local leaders, establishing defensive positions, launching counterattacks where possible, transforming what the Wordbearers had intended as a massacre into a genuine battle. As the fighting intensified, the true nature of the Wordbearers' transformation became apparent. Where once they had been zealous but recognizably estates, now they revealed the full extent of their corruption. Chaplains shed their skullhelms to reveal faces marked with blasphemous sigils, chanting invocations to entities the Ultramarines had been taught did not exist. Despite these horrors, the Ultramarines fought with increasing determination. Captain Ventenus emerged as a key leader, organizing a breakout from surrounded positions, retaking Caf's defense laser silos in a daring assault that shifted the balance of the orbital battle. These ground-based weapons designed to protect the planet from invasion now fired upward at the Wordbearer's fleet, destroying several vessels and forcing others to adjust their positions, creating opportunities that the embattled Ultramarine ships quickly exploited. As the battle's momentum began to shift, Cor Farron recognized that complete victory might elude him. The Ultramarines were adapting too quickly, their resistance too organized, their counterattacks too effective, but military victory had always been secondary to the ritual purpose of the assault. The true goal, the creation of a warp storm that would isolate Ultramar from the rest of the galaxy, could still be achieved even if the Wordbearers were ultimately forced to withdraw. In the great ritual chamber aboard the Infidus Imperator, Corian gathered his most powerful dark apostles and sorcerers. Around them, hundreds of human captives were arranged in patterns corresponding to arcane geometries, their bodies marked with symbols that burned through skin into the soul. The effect manifested first in Cal's system. The Vidian star, a stable yellow star similar to ancient Terra's sun, began to change. Heavy metals and unstable substances appeared within its photosphere, introduced not through physical means, but through reality alteration, their presence increasing the star's radiation output tenfold. The sudden surge of deadly energy bathed the system in killing light, particularly affecting Kaf itself, stripping away its atmosphere, rendering its surface increasingly hostile to human life. As the ruin storm manifested, bringing with it phenomena of the warp, the wordbearers began their withdrawal from Kaf. Ships disengaged from combat, breaking orbit in seemingly random patterns that nonetheless carried them away from the expanding stellar devastation. On the surface, some wordbearers' forces fought their way to extraction points, while others simply abandoned their positions, seeking shelter from the increasing radiation rather than continuing to engage the enemy. For many wordbearers, this withdrawal represented outright betrayal. Thousands of 17th Legion Astartes found themselves stranded on Kal's surface or trapped in its orbit as their brothers departed, left to face the vengeance of the Ultramarines and the environmental devastation of a dying world. These abandoned warriors were not randomly selected casualties of war, but deliberately sacrificed the elements of the Legion that Lorgar had deemed unreliable, too zealous in their hatred of the Ultramarines, too focused on personal vengeance rather than the greater purposes of chaos. This culling had been planned from the beginning. Means of purifying the Legion by removing those whose rage burned brighter than their sense, whose hatred might make them unreliable instruments for the subtle corruption still to come. As the surviving wordbearers' vessels limped toward the rendezvous point, where they would rejoin the main body of the Legion, the mood aboard the Infidus Imperator was somber. Corian, meditating in his private chambers surrounded by blasphemous icons, contemplated how he would present this outcome to Lorgar. The ruin storm had been conjured, yes, but at a cost higher than anticipated, with results less decisive than promised. Whether his adoptive son would view this as acceptable success or disappointing failure remained to be seen. The battle for Kal itself, which had begun as a straightforward, if treacherous military assault, had transformed into something more complex and horrific, a drawn-out apocalypse in which an entire planetary population faced extinction. While Space Marines fought for control of the underground refugees that represented their only hope of survival from the uninhabitable surface, what should have been a pivotal but brief engagement in the opening phases of the Horus Heresy instead became a lingering wound, a pocket of continuous conflict that would persist even as the main forces of both legions moved on to other battles across the galaxy. While Corian led the assault on K, Lorgar himself embarked on a different path of destruction alongside his brother Angren. The Shadow Crusade, as it would come to be known, cut a bleeding wound across the realm of Ultramar, a campaign of such deliberate cruelty that even hardened warriors of other traitor legions would later speak of it in hushed tones. Yet beneath the apparent savagery lay purpose, a carefully designed ritual of destruction that would change not just worlds, but the very fabric of reality. Lorgar had always felt a curious kinship with Angren. Both had known suffering. Lorgar through Coron's abuse and the Emperor's rejection. Angren through the horrors of the fighting pits and the loss of his gladiator family. This understanding gave Lorgar insight into Angren that others lacked. He saw beyond the bloodthirsty berserker to the wounded soul beneath, recognized the nobility that might have been had circumstances been different. Most importantly, he saw how the butcher's nails, the crude neural implants hammered into Angron's brain by his Nutrian slave masters, were killing his brother one headache at a time, destroying the Primarch's mind and body in a way that even transhuman physiology couldn't repair. The Shadow Crusade began with practical military objectives, securing the flank of Horus Rebellion, preventing Guilliman from leading his Ultramarines to Terror's defense. Lorgar and Angren led their combined forces, Wordbearers and World Eaters, in devastating attacks against Ultramar's 500 worlds, burning cities, shattering defenses, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. 26 worlds fell in rapid succession, each conquest bloodier than the last, as Angron's deteriorating condition drove him to ever greater frenzies of violence. But Lorgar's attention remained fixed on his brother as much as on their military campaign. He watched with growing concern as Angren's episodes became more frequent, his periods of lucidity shorter, the damage wrought by the nails accelerating at a frightening pace. The implants had never been designed for a Primarch's brain. They were slowly killing him, and the rate of degeneration had accelerated dramatically in the months since Kaf. Without intervention, Angron would be lost, not just to death but to complete neural collapse, his mind destroyed before his body finally failed. So the Shadow Crusade acquired a second, more personal purpose, to save Angren's life through Apothewa. This would require a ritual of immense power, a sacrifice worthy of the blood god's attention. The systematic destruction of Ultramar's worlds served as the opening movements of this ritual, each massacre building the psychic resonance that would eventually culminate in Angren's transformation. But for the final act, Lorgar needed a stage with personal significance, a place where Angren's pain had begun, where the circle could be closed through symbolic return. That place was New Syria, the world where Angren had been found by the Emperor, where he had fought as a gladiator, where he had led his doomed rebellion against the High Riders, the world where his gladiator brothers and sisters had died on a mountain called Daemonic Ridge, while he was unwillingly teleported to safety by the Emperor, forced to watch their deaths from orbit, the world where the butcher's nails had been hammered into his brain, beginning the slow death that Lorgar now sought to prevent. Convincing Angren to return to New Syria proved surprisingly easy. Though the Lord of the World Edators claimed to have put his past behind him, the wound of his lost comrades had never healed. When Lorgar suggested that the tech priests of Nusha might know more about the nails than anyone else in the galaxy, that they might hold the key to understanding the implants that were killing him, Angren agreed with little hesitation, whether he truly believed they would find answers there or simply wanted to confront his past. Perhaps even Angren himself didn't know. The initial landing on New Syria was not marked by immediate violence. Lorgar insisted they first visit the site of the final battle, the ridge where Angren's gladiator army had made their last stand. Standing on that blood-soaked ground, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Angren seemed almost calm, a stillness more unsettling than his usual rage, like the silence before a devastating storm. Lorgar watched his brother commune with memories, understanding that this moment of reflection was necessary for what would follow. From the ridge they traveled to the city-state of Desiree, seat of the government that had once claimed ownership of Angron. Here, the Primarch of the World Eaters intended to confront those who ruled, to demand answers about the nails, to look into the eyes of descendants of those who had enslaved him. What he found instead was a carefully maintained lie. Historical records claiming he had fled the battle at Delica, abandoned his comrades, left them to be massacred while he saved himself. This falsification of history, this character assassination designed to strip dignity from even the memory of rebellion, broke something in Angron that had somehow remained intact through all his previous suffering. His rage becoming something pure and terrible, a focused hatred that burned away all restraint. He ordered his legion to kill everyone in the city. Then they were to kill everyone on the planet. No exceptions, no survivors, no mercy. Nukria would pay for its lies with complete extinction. Throughout this slaughter, Lorgar observed with calm detachment. The violence served his purpose. Each death added to the psychic resonance building around New Syria. Each drop of blood spilled, bringing the ritual closer to completion. The world that had hurt his brother was dying, and from its death would come Angren's rebirth. The symmetry pleased Lorgar's poetic sensibilities, suffering transformed into transcendence, the site of greatest pain, becoming the stage for ultimate ascension. The arrival of Robert Gilliman with his Ultramarines fleet was not unexpected. The Primarch of the 13th Legion had been pursuing the Wordbearers since the betrayal at Kaf. His hunt temporarily abandoned when he received reports of his world under attack from the Furious Abyss, then resumed when that threat was dealt with. Now he had caught up to Lorgar and Angron, his vessels appearing in Nusha's system like avenging angels, his wrath cold and precise where Angren's was hot and chaotic. The battle joined on Uria's surface as Ultramarines dropped pods hammered home. These were not the pristine warriors Lorgar remembered from Monarchia. Their armor remained scarred and burn-washed from the atrocity at Kaf, their demeanor hardened by betrayal. In this chaos of battle, the confrontation that had been building since Monarchia finally occurred. Gilman found Lorgar directing the Wordbearers' efforts. His golden skin shimmering with warp energy, his armor inscribed with symbols that hurt the eye to look upon directly. The two Primarchs who had once stood together in the ashes of the perfect city now faced each other as enemies. Gilliman, the embodiment of the Emperor's secular vision. Lorgar, the herald of a new age of faith in darker gods. As they fought, Lorgar gradually gave ground, drawing Gilliman away from the main battle, separating him from his warriors. This was strategy, positioning his brother exactly where he needed him to be for the ritual's completion. When Gilliman finally landed a devastating blow, his power fist cracking Lorgar's sternum, the Wordbearer's Primarch responded not with counterattack, but with psychic assault, a telekinetic burst that sent Gilliman staggering backward. The Croceus followed, striking the Ultramarine Primarch's head with force that would have killed a mortal instantly, drawing first blood in a contest between demigods. The two Primarchs faced each other across blood-soaked ground. In this moment of temporary stalemate, the true purpose of Lorgar's plan revealed itself. From the Ultramarine ranks emerged Angron, his armor a shattered wreck, both chain axes dripping with the blood of loyal Astartes. On his chest hung the bandolier of skulls from Daemonic Ridge, now painted crimson with fresh blood. Even through the constant agony inflicted by the nails that pleased him, he had wanted his deceased brothers and sisters to taste blood once more. The World Eater launched himself at Gilliman, forcing the already wounded Ultramarine Primarch onto the defensive. As Angron pressed his attack, Lorgar withdrew from direct combat, taking position nearby where he could observe and guide what came next. With focused concentration, he began a ritual, a working of warpcraft that would transform Angron forever, saving his life while binding him irrevocably to the service of Khorne. The first spasms racked Angron's massive body, his blood turning to quicks, then to unholy fire that illuminated him from within. His cries of rage became screams of agony as his physical form began tearing itself apart in reconstruction, reshaping itself according to the template provided by K's power. He was becoming something greater and more terrible, transcending the limitations of flesh, while embodying the essence of rage and bloodshed that had defined his existence. Not all welcomed this transformation. The World Eater's librarians, those few who had never received the Butcher's nails implants due to their incompatibility with psychic abilities, sensed the warp energies being channeled by Lorgar. Understanding at least partially what was happening, these 19 remaining psychers attempted intervention, combining their powers to manifest a psychic entity known as the Communion. This Communion reached into the warp and grasped Lorgar's soul, attempting to pull it from his body to interrupt the ritual before it could be completed. For a brief, desperate moment, two psychic entities confronted each other in the immaterial realm. Lorgar's transcendent consciousness against the combined will of 19 battle psychers, each convinced they were saving Angron from a fate worse than death. But Lorgar had grown too powerful, his connection to the Ruinous Powers too strong. The Communion failed, its component minds overwhelmed by forces they could not comprehend. On the physical plane, Angron's transformation reached completion. Where once had stood a Primarch, a being of gene-crafted flesh, however mighty, now loomed a demon prince of Khorne. His body had grown enormously, his skin transformed to red scales, great wings spreading from his back, his head crowned with horns that dripped with molten brass. The being that had been Angron now straddled two realities, existing simultaneously in the material universe and the warp, drawing power from both, constrained by the limitations of neither. Faced with a demon of such power, a wounded Guilliman made the only possible choice: retreat. Gathering what forces he could, the Ultramarine Primarch withdrew from New Syria. Unable to defeat or even comprehend what his brothers had become, the Wordbearers and World Eaters allowed this withdrawal, confident in the knowledge that the ruined storm would prevent Guilliman from reaching Terror in time to affect the outcome of Horus' assault on the Emperor. As the traitor's journey toward Terror progressed, Lorgar found himself increasingly troubled by thoughts he could not easily dismiss. His visions, once so clear in their guidance, had become ambiguous, showing multiple possible futures where before he had seen only one inevitable path. In some of these futures, Horus triumphed, the Emperor was slain. Chaos reigned ascendant over a transformed humanity. In others, the rebellion failed, the loyalists prevailed, the work of the heresy undone before its full flowering. Most disturbing were the visions where Horus achieved victory, but then proved an unworthy vessel for the powers of chaos. His ambition outweighing his devotion, his desire for personal rule undermining the true purpose of the rebellion. These doubts were reinforced by Lorgar's observations of the War Master's behavior. Horus had begun to resist full submission to the Ruinous Powers, attempting to maintain his independence, even as he drew upon their strength. He spoke of ruling the galaxy in his own name once the Emperor was defeated, of establishing a new order with himself at its pinnacle. This was not the transcendent vision Lorgar had embraced, not the dissolution of boundaries between material and immaterial, not the elevation of humanity through communion with the warp, but merely the replacement of one tyrant with another. Following Horus, near death at Beta Jin, Lorgar's concerns deepened. The War Master had fallen into a coma, his physical form ravaged, his spirit wandering the immaterial realms. When he eventually recovered, it was through means that transformed him into something neither fully Primarch nor fully demon, an ever-shifting form with a moor of dark chaos energy at its core. A being whose nature seemed unstable, and whose purposes had become increasingly opaque. In this transformed Horus, Lorgar saw not the champion of chaos he had envisioned, but a compromised vessel. A leader whose devotion to the Ruinous Powers remained incomplete, whose understanding of the primordial truth was partial at best. The rebellion Lorgar had helped engineer, the heresy he had nurtured from its earliest seeds, seemed in danger of falling short of its true potential, becoming just a power struggle rather than the spiritual transformation he had foreseen. These concerns led Lorgar to a fateful decision. He would replace Horus as Wararm Master, taking direct command of the rebellion himself. Only then could he ensure that the war against the Emperor served its true purpose, not only toppling a regime, but fundamentally reshaping reality, merging the material and immaterial realms, elevating humanity to a new state of existence through partnership with the warp entities his father had taught them to fear. Executing this plan required careful preparation. Lorgar dispatched Zadulak, one of his most trusted dark apostles, to accompany him to the vengeful spirit Horus flagship. Using an oracle disciple created from the remains of Siren Valantian, a blind remembrancer who had once served the wordbearers as a guide, Lorgar, Lack, and a small force entered the webway, seeking to strengthen their position before confronting Horus. Their journey through the labyrinthine corridors of the webway led them to the Eye of Terror, and ultimately to the Palace of Slaanesh itself. There they discovered Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children, engaged in acts of debauchery alongside the demon Enai. When Lorgar attempted to recruit his brother for the coming coup, Fulgrim refused, unwilling to abandon his pleasures for what he viewed as political maneuvering beneath his dignity. The refusal forced Lara's hand. He engaged Fulgrim in combat, holding him at bay while Zadulak uttered the newly ascended Emperor's children, Primarch's true name, a word of power that bound the demon prince to the speaker's will. Lack had learned this name during a ritual Lorgar had conducted, but due to the amnesia, it would eventually cause its bearer. The wordbearer's Primarch had given the information to his dark apostle instead. With Fulgrim bound to Leak's commands, Lorgar now possessed a powerful weapon to use against Horus, a Primarch who could be ordered to attack at the crucial moment. After gathering the scattered Emperor's children legion, Lorgar and his newfound allies arrived at Ulanor, where Horus had summoned the traitor Primarchs and their legions for a final muster before the assault on Terror. The gathering included those Primarchs who had chosen to follow Horus into rebellion, though not all answered the summons. Some, like Alfreus, could not be found, while others chose to pursue their own objectives rather than submit to the War Master's authority. Lorgar's plan was elegantly simple. After sacrificing large numbers of mortal servants, he would unleash a psychic scream that would disorient Horus. Then Lack ordered Fulgrim to attack the Wordbearers and Emperor's children vessels, orbiting Ulanor would finish off the sons of Horus, leaving Elgar in total command of the traitor forces and the war effort against the Emperor. However, the coup quickly unraveled. The Chaos Mystic Acta, who had led Lorgar to the Palace of Slaanesh, had already warned Horus of the planned betrayal. Upon meeting the War Master on Ulanor, Lorgar was immediately attacked before he could unleash his psychic assault. Worse still, Zadulak betrayed him, freeing Fulgrim from his bindings instead of ordering him to attack Horus. The Dark Apostle had concluded that Lorgar's vision, while perhaps purer in its devotion to chaos, was less likely to succeed than Horus's approach. The confrontation between Lorgar and Horus was brief and one-sided. The War Master, in his new semi-demonic form, beat Lorgar mercilessly, then threw him his weapon and demanded he stand and fight. Lorgar refused, expressing not defiance, but pity for the monstrosity Horus had become since his recovery. The War Master was no longer the glorious champion of chaos he had once envisioned. He was now a being whose transformation had been incomplete, whose understanding of the primordial truth remained imperfect. Horus ordered Lorgar to leave his sight, pledging to kill him if he ever returned. The 5,000 wordbearers of the Chapter of the Unspeaking, who had followed Zadulak in his betrayal of their Primarch, would continue to serve Horus, campaigning with him on Terror. But the main body of the 17th Legion, still loyal to Lorgar despite his failed coup, withdrew from direct participation in the final assault on the Emperor's palace. As Lorgar departed Ulanor for destinations unknown, he left Horus with a prophecy that the War Master was doomed to failure due to his weakness, his unwillingness to fully embrace the Ruinous Powers and their vision for humanity's future. Whether this was genuine foresight or merely the bitter prediction of a defeated rival, events would soon prove Lorgar correct. The Siege of Terror would end with Horus's death aboard the vengeful spirit, the Emperor mortally wounded but triumphant. The forces of chaos repulsed from humanity's birthworld. The Wordbearers in themselves played little direct role in the Siege of Terror. While the contingent under Zadulak fought alongside the other traitor legions, Lorgar and the majority of his sons had withdrawn to consider their next moves. This absence from the climactic battle of the heresy created divisions within the legion that would persist for millennia. Some viewing Lorgar's actions as wise foresight, others as cowardice or abandonment of the cause they had fought so hard to advance. In the aftermath of Horus' defeat, as the traitor legions fled Terror and scattered across the galaxy, the Wordbearers found themselves at a crossroads. Their Primarch's vision had been rejected, not just by the Emperor, but by Horus as well. The rebellion they had helped engineer had failed in its ultimate objective. The transcendent future Lorgar had foreseen humanity, united with the warp rather than separated from it, seemed further from realization than ever. Yet they had not lost everything. The Imperium, though victorious, had been grievously wounded. The Emperor, though alive, was confined to the Golden Throne, unable to directly guide his realm. The imperial truth lay in ruins, replaced by the very religious worship Lorgar had once advocated, though directed toward the Emperor rather than the Chaos Gods. And the Wordbearers themselves remained a cohesive fighting force, their faith undimmed by defeat, their devotion to the Ruinous Powers unshaken by the failure of Horus's rebellion. As they retreated to the Eye of Terror and the Maelstrom, the Wordbearers began to rebuild and regroup. Life within the warp rifts transformed the Wordbearers in ways both physical and spiritual. Exposure to raw chaos energies accelerated mutations that had begun during the heresy. The Legion's gene seed responding to environmental stimuli in unpredictable ways. Some warriors developed scales or horns, others additional limbs or organs, their bodies reshaping to reflect their devotion to particular aspects of chaos. These changes were not viewed with horror, but embraced as signs of divine favor, visible markers of the gods' attention. More profound were the psychological changes. Time flowed differently within the Eye of Terror, stretching and compressing according to no discernible pattern. A warrior might experience what felt like decades, while only days passed in the material universe, or might lose years in what seemed like moments. This temporal distortion created a sense of disconnection from linear existence, reinforcing the Legion's rejection of material limitations and their embrace of warp-based. The universe bent and warped around Lorgar like molten glass, surrendering to an unseen sculptor's flame. Reality itself weeping oily tears of surrender, as the Primarch, who had once kneeled as a penitent in Monarchia's ashes, now ascended beyond all mortal constraints. Time twisted into irrelevance, years bleeding into centuries or perhaps moments, stretched across eternities within that impossible cathedral he had forged from screaming flesh and warp lightning. Its vaulted ceilings ribbed with exposed cartilage, its stained glass windows fashioned from crystallized agony that refracted scenes of the heresy into fractured tableaus of damnation. Here, amidst the wet slap of contracting muscle walls and the drone of a billion demonic hymns echoing through corridors of living tissue, Lorgar offered himself not as supplicant, but as a consecrated vessel, his ancient scholar's hands outstretched not in benediction, but in bloody demand. Ruinous Powers answered with gifts that unknit his Primarch biology, his golden skin sloughing away in molten ribbons, his bones cracking into divine fractals, his very soul reforged in the crucible of their hungers. When the ritual pyre burned out, what emerged stood both anchored to the materium and adrift in the Empyrean, a data shard wrapped in scripturesque flesh, eyes now voids into which entire systems could disappear. Yet this apotheosis birthed neither triumph nor reckoningly silence. The newborn demon Primarch retreated to the Cyclopean spires of the Templum, in Fissio on Sicarius, sealing himself behind walls etched with prophecies not yet deciphered, descending into meditations so profound they became a second chrysalis. None dared disturb this sanctified stasis knot. Even his most fervent dark apostles could decipher whether their genocide plotted vengeance against the Corpse Emperor's realm or languished in some unfathomable spiritual abyss, his consciousness adrift in the fathomless depths of the great ocean. The void Lorgar left behind yawned like an unhealed wound, yet the XVII Legion and Duredno thrived in their father's shadowed absence. Where other traitor legions fractured into squabbling warbands, the Word-bearers clung to unity through shared sacrament, their dark faith a chain stronger than blood or ambition. The Dark Council convened beneath Sicarius, ever-churning Sciessa pantheon of holy butchers gathered in the Basilica of the Word, that grotesque ossuary where barbed spires clawed at the firmament, their iron spikes adorned with living sacrifices, whose endless screams lubricated the gears of the Legion's infernal machinery. From this nexus of sacrilege, the apostles orchestrated a crusade both meticulous and merciless, their tendrils spreading like mycelium through the rotted flesh of the Imperium. Entire sectors became their scripture, each conquered world a stanza in the epic poem of humanity's deliverance. Their methodology mirrored Lorgar's own duality, part philosopher, part executioner. On target worlds, they first seduced the disenfranchised, Hivegangers choking on ash and hopelessness, agri-world serfs crushed under tithe quotas, bureaucrats sickened by imperial lies. Whispered gospels arrived as liberation truths wrapped in the language of rebellion, promises of power to the powerless, secrets that pried open psychic gifts the black ships would have harvested. Catacombs became chapels, worker unions mutated into congregations, and children's nurseries hummed with lullabies praising the Eightfold Path. Patient as spiders, the bearers nurtured these nascent cults with smuggled grimoires, relics that wept blood, and war plagues disguised as rations corruption blossoming unseen, until the planet's spine cracked beneath its own apostasy. Only then would the Legion's fleets rip open the sky, descending as saviors upon populations already drunk on Kool-Aid brewed from heresy. These liberations culminated in orgies of transmogrification at her cities, reshaped into flesh laboratories, warp rifts blooming like carnivorous flowers, and fresh legions of zealots swearing oaths in gore-slicked arenas. Yet the bearers recorded these victories not as territorial gains, but as sacraments each fallen world and altar upon which the galaxy's inevitable transfiguration was celebrated. Their Bible was the Book of Lorgar, its pages breathing with the Primarch's own essence, its opening confession all I ever wanted was the truth, an infectious mantra that bypassed reason to nestle in the liver and the lungs. This unshakable unity, however, concealed a schism as old as the Legion's damnation. From his Twilight Redoubt, the first chaplain Erebus preached the slow gospel no mere cultist, but a viral theologian, whose agents seeded ideas so corrosive they could eat through Adeptus Terra edicts within generations. His sermons unfolded across centuries. A minor Shrineworld's liturgical language gradually replaced by chaos glossolalia, a night house's machine spirits whispering thirsts for soul fuel, a rogue traitor dynasty degenerating into a mobile coven. Contrasting this glacial heresy, Corferon Lorgar's father in all but blood-orchestrated symphonies of annihilation from his fortress on Galmech. His warships fell upon imperial strongholds like scavenger birds on a carcass, his possessed cohorts methodically dismantling defenses not for territory, but to prove the Corpse Emperor's impotence. Where Erebus embedded spores, Corferon salted earth. Where the chaplain converted, the captain martyred. Their Cold War simmered in assassinations masquerading as accidents, in rival cults fed contradictory prophecies, in entire war zones becoming chessboards for their clashing eschatologies. Neither could usurp the other. Lorgar's ghostly influence preserved their stalemate, a divine tension that drove the Legion ever forward. Millennia unfurled, the bearers' work eroding reality's foundations. Warp storms brewed where their rites climaxed, the veil thinning until nightmares strolled through marketplace crowds unchallenged. Psykers bloomed like poisonous fungi, their unchecked powers ripping open psychic abscesses. The Imperium, rotting from within by the bearers, meticulously planted cancers, hemorrhaged faith and stability a death by 10,000 cuts administered with surgical zeal. When Cadia fell and the cicatrix maledictum tore the firmament asunder, it was not accident but apotheosist bearers, ambitions made manifest on a galactic scale. Screaming cultists on 1,000 worlds found their marks of chaos blazing as the sky split, ecclesiarchy priests spontaneously combusting mid-sermon, entire battle fleets swallowed by sudden warp rifts. In this newborn age of screaming revelation, whispers slithered from Sicarius depths, Lorgar stirs. Sightings conflated into myth-demon Primarch seen leading a host of Neverborn through the ruins of Ultramar, his shadow melting plasteel fortresses into screaming faces, his voice vibrating inside the minds of dark apostles as they slept, imparting fresh terrors from the book's unwritten pages, pilgrims near the maelstrom swearing they witnessed his silhouette eclipsing dying stars, arms outstretched as if embracing the galaxy's unraveling. Whether manifestation or collective delirium, these omens electrified the Legion. From the Eye's heart and the Maelstrom's whirligig depths, the XVII rekindled their oldest crusadist not as scavengers, but as prophets arriving precisely where the great rift's howling winds had snapped supply lines and faith alike. Imperial worlds, abandoned by distant Terra, greeted the bearers not with fear but desperate gratitude. Their preachers arrived bearing salvation wrapped in truths that liquefied sanity, their chaplains offering communion wafers that sprawled tendrils down worshippers' throats. Amidst it all, the bearers moved with the eerie serenity of those who had charted this exact collapse 10,000 years prior, their conviction an unbreakable spine beneath the galaxy's convulsions. They were the patient gardeners of apocalypse, the midwives of transcendence, architects laboring toward a singular revelation that divinity wore, not a single face bound to a golden throne, but a kaleidoscopic array of hungers eager to embrace humanity, if only it would shed its feeble material shackles. To them, the Long War was no grudge match, but a grand homily, every bolter blast a punctuation mark, every converted soul a sacrament, every dying world a verse in the cosmic hymn that would crescendo when Lorgar's vision finally consumed the frail lie of imperial reality. Arden gasped as if breaking an oily surface, the chronicle's last words searing his retinas like afterimages from a supernova. The Liber Daemonicus lay closed in his lap, its leather binding now fever-warm and thrumming, as though prison things scratched from within. His joints creaked reminders of 18 motionless hours spent while Ethanus V completed its jagged waltz outside the viewport. Night now reigned, the planet's volcanic arteries painting its toxic shroud in pulsing vermilion, a rhythm that synced unnervingly with the throbbing behind Arden's eyes. He'd ignored the failing lumen's death rattle earlier. No, the half-lit cabin seemed saturated with weight, shadows coalescing into forms too fluid for Euclidean space. Removing his spectacles did nothing to banish the visions etched into his optic nerves, Lorgar kneeling not in ash, but in a slurry of dissolved cities. The basilica's spires spearing screaming infants. Corferon's smile, as a loyalist world's last church erupted into a dais for something with too many mouths. The Chronos pulse matched the headache drumming behind his temples. Somewhere in the ship's bowels, a pipe burst with a wet shriek. Arden shuddered, suddenly certain that the words he'd consumed weren't mere history, but a contagion and his feverish mind the perfect host. The silver letter opener caught the trembling candlelight as Arden lifted it, its edge glinting like a shard of frozen time suspended between past and present. The Wordbearer's chronicle lay before him, its leathered cover still warm from his touch, still humming with the echo of 10,000 years of whispered heresies. It wasn't just words on vellum, it was a wound in reality, a psychic scar he'd peeled open with every turned page. Angron's howling descent from broken brother to butcher god hadn't been described, it had been vomited into his mind in technicolor agony, the nails bite sharper than any blade. Lorgar's pilgrimage from golden prophet to architect of the Ruinstorm hadn't unfolded as tidy history it had seeped into his marrow like tar, showing how devotion could curdle into dogma, then metastasize into something monstrous beneath the weight of betrayed ideals. The air tasted of incense and iron now, though no blood had been spilled in this cramped cabin. Only truth, and truth, he was learning, bled more profusely than lies. His hands moved automatically, swaddling the tome in layers of waxcloth, each fold a surrender to protocol. The imperial aquila embossed on the cloth surface seemed to squirm under his fingers. Somewhere beyond the bulkhead, the ship groaned into morning watchboots marched in lockstep. Servitors chanted binary hymns. Crewmen exchanged the hollow pleasantries of those who'd survived another night in the void. Soon they'd come for him. They'd smell the heresy on him like promethium on an arsonist. The service call drifted closer, its single lens whirring as it captured the tremor in his knuckles, the saw tracks drying on parchment cheeks. Let it record. He'd gift them excuses wrapped in scholars' lace necessary evil, enemy psychology, the cold calculus of understanding what you burn. But the chronicle hadn't been studied. It had infested. His gaze snagged on the shrine's modest aquila, its gold plating dull beneath the votive's guttering flame. 60 years he'd bowed to that symbol, offered his aches and obediences, trusted its light to ward away doubt. But the candle suddenly guttered, and in that flicker he saw not hope, but hollow icicates, the Emperor's suffering throne reflected in miniature, and his own faith as threadbare as frayed prayer parchment. Lorgar's face swam behind his eyelids, not the caricature from Lectio Divinitatis engravings, but flesh. Flesh that wept when his father scolded him, that trembled as he offered the wrong prayers, that cracked open like overripe fruit when the Primarch's unquenchable need for purpose met the whispering promises of false gods. The Wordbearers had fallen, they delaned, and the galaxy had shattered under their weight. The journal opened itself beneath his hands, the quill a lead weight. He didn't transcribe, autopsied. Script spidered across vellum, not chronicling events but dissecting the rot beneath imperial platitudes. How many generations of archivists had stacked sanitized histories like bricks, mortaring over the cracks with holy lies. A droplet splattered the page. Teardrop. His hand rose, surprised by the moisture. When did weeping start? Not for himself or the yawning galaxy grave the heresy had dug. For Terra burning. For the trillion voiceless dead whose only crime was breathing in the wrong empire. For Euphrates Keeler's first saintly miracle curdling into last stands on poisoned soil. For the Emperor's scream reverberating through 10 millennia, father's agony amplified through his children's skulls. And yes, even for Lorgar Aurelian, the poe-child who built temples in deserts, desperate for some onanyanito whisper he was loved. The drawer swallowed the chronicle's corpse shape with a click. Brass key bit into his sternum through his robes. False sanctuary. They'd smell its taint soon enough. The viewport beckoned a rectangle of false solace framing Etharnus V's corpse-green orb. What cataclysm had birthed such verdigris rot? Warp winds, Archaeovirus, or darker seeds planted by pilgrims who wore the word like a skin suit. This book wasn't unique. Every hivespire hid a shelf like this. Every shrine world buried its own gospel of errors. And they called him hereticus, only the guilty fear truth. The thought should have choked him. Instead clarity, oceans of it, crushing and cold. To fight monsters, you first had to admit they were once men. That they chose damnation not from inhumanity, but from too much humanity, too much need, too much faith, too much love twisted into weapons by patient, smiling darkness. The vox chimed 3 sharp notes. Praxer Salvin, the missionary imperator, no doubt already composing his disappointed glare. Arden floated toward the basin, composure settling over his shoulders like a burial shroud. Water shocked his face awake. The mirror showed Cracksbayperry skin mapped with new crevices, eyes like muddy voids after monsoon rains. But inside, a coal glowed. The Chronicle's revelations hadn't poisoned they'd purged, scorched away the comforting cataracts. The imperial truth was a child's fable. Faith untempered by wisdom was a primed grenade. Perhaps the emperor, god or martyr or mistake, didn't want blind devotees. Perhaps he needed archivists willing to walk into the dark with both eyes open, cupping fragile flames of forbidden knowledge against winds that howled from both throne and abyss. The corridor yawned a gullet of durasteel and scrubbed air. His cabin sealed behind him with a sigh. Only the service gull drifted alongside, monocular unblinking. Was it recording his pulse's syncopated rhythm, his too quick breath, the way his fingers brushed the pendant beneath his collar knot in piety now, but packed? They'd ask about the tome. He'd give them Ashthan truths, coordinates, dates, Angron's tooth count meticulously notated. He'd say recommend immediate purgation with lips that felt like grave dirt. And later, when the interrogators peeled back his eyelids with their questions, he'd recite chapter and verse until they gagged on the very words they forced him to bury. Let the skull witness that. Let it feast upon his obeisance. His shadow stretched long under lumens as he walked, merging with the deeper darkness between bulkheads. Behind him, through sealed doors, the votive candles flamed shuddered not from draught, but dark. Crimson kissed its tip just once like a lover's farewell, or a welcome. The sound of Arden's boots faded down the hall, each step a careful heresy, each breath a silent promise to the book in its drawer. Sleep a while longer. Let them burn your brothers too much. Let them forget why your words frighten them. Then we'll wake again, you and I, when the Empire's foundations creak under the weight of their own untruths. The service cull hovered, recording nothing but footfalls and duty. It missed, as all apparatus of control does, the flicker in the old man's step-not shoulder-bowed resignation, but purpose. The same fire that once drove Lorgar to madness, Angron to brokenness, and 100 forgotten archivists before Arden to choose truth over survival. Bright, cold. Utterly human, the most dangerous flame of all.